Chapter 18 of Fair Margaret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Demetre, East Haven, Connecticut. Fair Margaret by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 18. The Holy Hermandad. Down the long passages, through the great fretted halls, across the cool marble courts flitted Inez and Margaret. It was like a dream. They went through a room where women, idling or working at tapestries, looked at them curiously. Margaret heard one of them say to another, "Why does the Donna Margaret's cousin leave her?" And the answer, "Because she is in love with the Marquise herself, and cannot bear to stay." "What a fool," said the first woman. "She is good-looking, and would only have had to wait a few weeks." They passed an open door, that of Morea's own chambers. Within it he stood and watched them go by. When they were opposite to him, some doubt or idea seemed to strike his mind, for he looked at them keenly, stepped forward, then, thinking better of it, or perhaps remembering Betty's bitter tongue, halted and turned aside. That danger had gone by. At length, none hindering them, they reached the yard where the escort and the horses waited. Here, standing under an archway, were Castell and Peter. Castell greeted Margaret in English and kissed her through her veil, while Peter, who had not seen her close since months before he rode away to Dedham, stared at her with all his eyes, and began to draw near to her, designing to find out, as he was sure he could do if once he touched her, whether indeed this were Margaret or only Betty after all. Guessing what was in his mind, and that he might reveal everything, Inez, who held a long pin in her hand with which she was fastening her veil that had come loose, pretended to knock against him, and ran the point deep into his arm, muttering, "Fool," as she did so. He sprang back with an oath. The guard smiled, and she began to pray his pardon. Castell helped Margaret onto her horse, then mounted his own, as did Peter, still rubbing his arm, but not daring to look towards Margaret, whose hand Inez shook familiarly in farewell, as though she were her equal, addressing her the while in terms of endearment such as Spanish women use to each other. An officer of Morea's household came and counted them, saying, "2 men and a woman, that is right, though I cannot see the woman's face." For a moment he seemed to be about to order her to unveil, but Inez called to him that it was not decent before all these Moors, whereon he nodded and ordered the captain to proceed. They rode through the arch of the castle along the roadway, through the great gate of the wall also, where the guard questioned their escort, stared at them, and, after receiving a present from Castell, let them go, telling them they were lucky Christians to get alive out of Granada, as indeed they were. At the brow of the rise, Margaret turned and waved her handkerchief towards that high window which she knew so well. Another handkerchief was waved in answer, and, thinking of the lonely Betty watching them there while she awaited the issue of her desperate venture, Margaret went on, weeping beneath her veil. For an hour they rode forward, speaking few words to each other, till at length they came to the crossroads, one of which ran to Malaga, and the other towards Seville. Here the escort halted, saying that their orders were to leave them at this point, and asking which road they intended to take. Castell answered that to Malaga, whereon the captain replied that they were wise, as they were less likely to meet bands of marauding thieves who called themselves Christian soldiers, and murdered or robbed all travelers who fell into their hands. Then Castell offered him a present, which he accepted gravely as though he did him a great favor, and, after bows and salutations, they departed. As soon as the Moors were gone, the three rode a little way towards Malaga. Then, when there was nobody in sight, they turned across country and gained the Seville road. At last they were alone, and, halting beneath the walls of a house that had been burnt in some Christian raid, they spoke together freely for the first time, and oh, what a moment that was for all of them. Peter pushed his horse alongside that of Margaret, crying, "Speak, beloved, is it truly you?" But Margaret, taking no heed of him, leant over and, throwing her arm around her father's neck, kissed him again and again through her veil, blessing God that they had lived to meet in safety. Peter tried to kiss her also, but she caused her horse to move so that he nearly fell from his saddle. "Have a care, Peter," she said to him, "or your love of kissing will lead you into more trouble." Whereon, guessing of what she spoke, he colored furiously and began to explain at length. "Cease," she said, "cease. I know all that story, for I saw you." Then, relenting, with some brief, sweet words of greeting and gratitude, gave him her hand, which he kissed often enough. "Come," said Castell, "we must push on, who have 20 miles to cover before we reach that inn where Israel has arranged that we should sleep tonight. We will talk as we go." And talk they did, as well as the roughness of the road and the speed at which they must travel would allow. Riding as hard as they were able, at length they came to the venta, or rough hostelry, just as the darkness closed in. At the sight of it, they thanked God aloud, for this place was across the Moorish border, and now they had little to fear from Granada. The host, a half-bred Spaniard and a Christian, expected them, having received a message from Israel, with whom he had had dealings, and gave them 2 rooms, rude enough, but sufficient, and good food and wine, also stabling and barley for their horses, bidding them sleep well and have no fear, as he and his people would watch and warn them of any danger. Yet it was late before they slept, who had so much to say to each other, especially Peter and Margaret, and were so happy at their escape, if only for a little while. Yet across their joy, like the sound of a funeral bell at a merry feast, came the thought of Betty and that fateful marriage in which ere now she must have played her part. Indeed, at last Margaret knelt down and offered up prayers to heaven that the saints might protect her cousin in the great peril which she had incurred for them, nor was Peter ashamed to join her in that prayer. Then they embraced, especially Peter and Margaret, and laid them down, Castell and his daughter in one room, and Peter in the other, and slept as best they could. Half an hour before dawn, Peter was up seeing to the horses, while the others breakfasted and packed the food that the landlord had made ready for their journey. Then he also swallowed some meat and wine, and at the first break of day, having discharged their reckoning and taken a letter from their host to those of other inns upon the road, they pressed on towards Seville, very thankful to find that as yet there were no signs of their being pursued. All that day, with short pauses to rest themselves and their horses, they rode on without accident, for the most part over a fertile plain watered by several rivers, which they crossed at fords or over bridges. As night fell, they reached the old town of Oxuna, which for many hours they had seen set upon its hill before them, and, notwithstanding their Moorish dress, made their way almost unobserved in the darkness to that inn which they had been recommended. Here, although he stared at their garments, on finding that they had plenty of money, the landlord received them well enough, and, again, they were fortunate in securing rooms to themselves. It had been their purpose to buy Spanish clothes in this town, but, as it happened, it was a feast day, and at night every shop in the place was closed, so they could get none. Now, as they greatly desired to reach Seville by the following nightfall, hoping under cover of the darkness to find and come aboard of their ship, the Margaret, which they knew lay safely in the river, and had been advised by messenger of their intended journey, it was necessary for them to leave Oxuna before the dawn. So, unfortunately enough as it proved, it was impossible for them to put off their Moorish robes and clothe themselves as Christians. They had hoped, too, that here at Oxuna Inez might overtake them, as she had promised to do if she could, and give them tidings of what had happened since they left Granada. But no Inez came. So, comforting themselves with the thought that however hard she rode, it would be difficult for her to reach them who had some hours' start, they left Oxuna in the darkness before anyone was astir. Having crossed some miles of plain, they passed up through olive groves into hills where cork trees grew, and here stopped to eat and let the horses feed. Just as they were starting on again, Peter, looking round, saw mounted men, a dozen or more of them, of very wild aspect, cantering through the trees, evidently with the object of cutting them off. "Thieves!" he said shortly. "Ride for it!" So they began to gallop, and their horses, although somewhat jaded, being very swift, passed in front of these men before they could regain the road. The band shouted to them to surrender, and, as they did not stop, loosed a few arrows and pursued them, while they galloped down the hillside onto a plain which separated them from more hills, also clothed with cork trees. This plain was about 3 miles wide and boggy in places. Still, they kept well ahead of the brigands, as they took them to be, hoping that they would give up the pursuit or lose sight of them amongst the trees. As they entered these, however, to their dismay they saw drawn up in front of them, and right across the road, another band of rough-looking men, perhaps 12 in all. "Trap," said Peter. "We must ride through them. It is our only chance," at the same time spurring his horse to the front and drawing his sword. Choosing the spot where their line was weakest, he dashed through it easily enough, but next second heard a cry from Margaret, and pulled his horse round to see that her mare had fallen, and that she and Castell were in the hands of the thieves. Indeed, already rough men had hold of her, and one of them was trying to tear the veil from her face. With a shout of rage, Peter charged them and struck so fierce a blow that his sword cut through the fellow's helmet into his skull, so that he fell down, dying or dead, Margaret's veil still in his hand. Then they rushed at him, 5 or 6 of them, and, although he wounded another man, dragged him from his horse, and, as he lay upon his back, sprang at him to finish him before he could rise. Already their knives and swords were over him, and he was making his farewells to life, when he heard a voice command them to desist and bind his arms. This was quickly done, and he was suffered to rise from the ground to see before him, not Morea, as he half expected, but a man clad in fine armour beneath his rough cloak, evidently an officer of rank. "What kind of a Moor are you?" he asked, "who dare to kill the soldiers of the Holy Hermandad in the heart of the king's country?" And he pointed to the dead man. "I am not a Moor," answered Peter in his rough Spanish. "I am a Christian, escaped from Granada, and I cut down that man because he was trying to insult my betrothed, as you would have done, signor. I did not know that he was a soldier of the Hermandad. I thought him a common thief of the hills." This speech, or as much as he could understand of it, seemed to please the officer, but before he could answer, Castell said, "Sir officer, this signor is an Englishman and does not speak your language well." "He uses his sword well anyhow," interrupted the captain, glancing at the dead soldier's cloven helm and head. "Yes, sir, he is of your trade, and, as the scar upon his face shows, has fought in many wars. Sir, what he tells you is true. We are Christian captives, escaped from Granada, and flying to Seville with my daughter, to whom I pray you to do no harm, to ask for the protection of their gracious majesties, and to find a passage back to England." "You do not look like an Englishman," answered the captain. "You look like a Marrano." "Sir, I cannot help my looks. I am a merchant of London, Castell by name. It is one well known in Seville and throughout this land, where I have large dealings, as if I can but see him, your king himself will acknowledge. Be not deceived by our dress, which we had to put on in order to escape from Granada, but I beseech you, let us go on to Seville." "Signor Castell," answered the officer, "I am the Captain Arrano of Puebla, and since you would not stop when we called to you, and have killed one of my best soldiers, to Seville you must certainly go, but with me, not by yourselves. You are my prisoners, but have no fear. No violence shall be done to you or the lady, who must take your trials for your deeds before the king's court, and there tell your story, true or false." So, having been disarmed of their swords, they were allowed to remount their horses and taken on towards Seville as prisoners. "At least," said Margaret to Peter, "we have nothing more to fear from highwaymen, and have escaped these soldiers' swords unhurt." "Yes," answered Peter with a groan, "but I hope that tonight we should have slept upon the Margaret while she slipped down the river towards the open sea, and not in a Spanish jail. Now, as fate will have it, for the second time I have killed a man on your behalf, and all the business will begin again. Truly, our luck is bad." "I think it might be worse, and I cannot blame you for that deed," answered Margaret, remembering the rough hands of the dead soldier, whom some of his comrades had stopped behind to bury. During all the remainder of that long day, they rode on through the burning heat, across the rich, cultivated plain, towards the great city of Seville, whereof the Giralda, which once had been the minaret of a Moorish mosque, towered hundreds of feet into the air before them. At length, towards evening, they entered the eastern suburbs of the vast city, and, passing through them, and a great gate beyond, began to thread its tortuous streets. "Whither we go, Captain Arano?" asked Castell presently.
"To the prison of the Holy Hermandad to await your trial for the slaying of one of its soldiers," answered the officer.
"I pray that we may get there soon, then," said Peter, looking at Margaret, who, overcome with fatigue, swayed upon her saddle like a flower in the wind. "So do I," muttered Castell, glancing round at the dark faces of the people who, having discovered that they had killed a Spanish soldier, and, taking them to be Moors, were marching alongside of them in great numbers, staring sullenly, or cursing them for infidels. Indeed, once when they passed a square, a priest in the mob cried out, "Kill them!" whereon a number of rough fellows made a rush to pull them off their horses, and were, with difficulty, beaten back by the soldiers. Foiled in this attempt, they began to pelt them with garbage, so that soon their white robes were stained and filthy. One fellow, too, threw a stone which struck Margaret on the wrist, causing her to cry out and drop her rein. This was too much for the hot-blooded Peter, who, spurring his horse alongside of him, before the soldiers could interfere, hit him such a buffet in the face that the man rolled upon the ground. Now Castell thought that they would certainly be killed, but to his surprise the mob only laughed and shouted such things as, "Well hit, Moor! That infidel has a strong arm!" and so forth. Nor was the officer angry, for when the man rose, a knife in his hand, he drew his sword and struck him down again with the flat of it, saying to Peter,
"Do not sully your hand with such street swine, Signor."
Then he turned and commanded his men to charge the crowd ahead of them. So they got through these people and, after many twists and turns down side streets to avoid the main avenues, came to a great and gloomy building and into a courtyard through barred gates that were opened at their approach and shut after them. Here they were ordered to dismount, and their horses led away, while the officer, Arano, entered into conversation with the governor of the prison, a man with a stern but not unkindly face, who surveyed them with much curiosity. Presently he approached and asked them if they could pay for good rooms, as if not, he must put them in the common cells. Castell answered, "Yes," and by way of earnest of it, produced 5 pieces of gold, and giving them to the Captain Arano, begged him to distribute them among his soldiers as a thank-offering for their protection of them through the streets. Also, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, that he would be willing to compensate the relatives of the man whom Peter had killed by accident, an announcement that evidently impressed his comrades very favorably. Indeed, one of them said he would bear the message to his widow, and, on behalf of the rest, thanked him for his gift. Then, having bade farewell to the officer, who told them that they would meet again before the judges, they were led through the various passages of the prison to 2 rooms, one small and one of a fair size, with heavily barred windows, given water to wash in, and told that food would be brought to them. In due course it came, carried by jailers, meat, eggs, and wine, and glad enough were they to see it. While they ate, also the governor appeared with a notary, and, having waited till their meal was finished, began to question them. "Our story is long," said Castell, "but with your leave I will tell it you. Only, I pray you, suffer my daughter, the Donna Margaret, to go to her rest, for she is quite outworn, and if you will, you can question her tomorrow." The governor assenting, Margaret threw off her veil to embrace her father, thus showing her beauty for the first time, whereat the governor and the notary stared amazed. Then, having given Peter her hand to kiss, and curtsied to the governor and the notary, she went to her bed in the next room, which opened out of that in which they were. When she had gone, Castell told his story of how his daughter had been kidnapped by the Marquis of Morea, a name that caused the governor to open his eyes very wide, and brought from London to Granada, whither they, her father and her betrothed, had followed her and escaped. But of Betty and all the business of the changed bride he said nothing. Also, knowing that these must come out in any case, he told them his name and his business, and those of his partners and correspondents in Seville, the firm of Bernaldez, which was one that the governor knew well enough, and prayed that the head of that firm, the Señor Juan Bernaldez, might be communicated with and allowed to visit them on the next morning. Lastly, he explained that they were no thieves or adventurers, but English subjects in misfortune, and again hinted that they were both able and willing to pay for any kindness or consideration that was shown to them, of all of which sayings the governor took note. Also, this officer said that he would communicate with his superiors and, if no objection were made, send a messenger to ask the Señor Bernaldez to attend at the prison on the following day. Then, at length, he and the notary departed, and, the jailers having cleared away the food and locked the door, Castell and Peter lay down on the beds that they had made ready for them, thankful enough to find themselves at Seville, even though in a prison, where indeed they slept very well that night. On the following morning, they woke much refreshed, and after they had breakfasted, the governor appeared, and with him none other than the Señor Juan Bernaldez, Castell's secret correspondent and Spanish partner, whom he had last seen some years before in England, a stout man with a quiet, clever face, not over-given to words. Greeting them with a deference that was not lost upon the governor, he asked whether he had leave to speak with them alone. The governor assented and went, saying he would return within an hour. As soon as the door was closed behind him, Bernaldez said,
"This is a strange place to meet you in, John Castell, yet I am not altogether surprised, since some of your messages reached me through our friends the Jews. Also, your ship, the Margaret, lies refitted in the river, and to avoid suspicion, I have been lading her slowly with a cargo for England. Though how you will come aboard that ship is more than I can say, but we have no time to waste. Tell me all your story, keeping nothing back." So they told him everything as quickly as they could while he listened silently. When they had done, he said, addressing Peter, "It is 1,000 pities, young sir, that you could not keep your hands off that soldier, for now the trouble that was nearly done with has begun anew, and in a worse shape. The Marquis of Morella is a very powerful man in this kingdom, as you may know from the fact that he was sent to London by their majesties to negotiate a treaty with your English King Henry as to the Jews and their treatment, should any of them escape thither after they have been expelled from Spain, for nothing less is in the wind, and I would have you know that their majesties hate the Jews, and especially the Marranos, whom already they burn by dozens here in Seville." And he glanced meaningly at Castell. "I am very sorry," said Peter, "but the fellow handled her roughly, and I was maddened at the sight and could not help myself. This is the second time that I have come into trouble from the same cause. Also, I thought that he was but a bandit." "Love is a bad diplomatist," replied Bernaldez with a little smile, "and who can count last year's clouds? What is done is done. Now I will try to arrange that the three of you shall be brought straight before their majesties when they sit to hear cases on the day after tomorrow. With the queen you will have a better chance than at the hands of any alcalde. She has a heart, if only one can get at it. That is, except where the Jews and Marranos are concerned." And again he glanced at Castell. "Meanwhile, there is money in plenty, and in Spain we ride to heaven on gold angels," he added, alluding to that coin and the national corruption. Before they could say more, the governor returned, saying that the Señor Bernaldez's time was up, and asking if they had finished their talk. "Not altogether," said Margaret. "Noble governor, is it permitted that the Señor Bernaldez should send me some Christian clothes to wear? For I would not appear before your judges in this soiled heathen garb, nor, I think, would my father or the Señor Brome." The governor laughed and said he thought that might be arranged, and even allowed them another 5 minutes while they talked of what these clothes should be. Then he departed with Bernaldez, leaving them alone. It was not until the latter had gone, however, that they remembered that they had forgotten to ask him whether he had heard anything of the woman Inez, who had been furnished with his address, but, as he had said nothing of her, they felt sure that she could not have arrived in Seville.
and once more were much afraid as to what might have happened after they had left Granada. That night, to their grief and alarm, a new trouble fell on them. Just as they finished their supper, the governor appeared and said that, by order of the court before which they must be tried, the Signor Brome, who was accused of murder, must be separated from them. So, in spite of all they could say or do, Peter was led away to a separate cell, leaving Margaret weeping. End of Chapter 18. Recording by John Demetre, East Haven, Connecticut.
Chapter 19 of Fair Margaret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Fair Margaret by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 19. Betty Pays Her Debts. Betty Dean was not a woman afflicted with fears or apprehensions. Born of good parents, but in poverty, for 26 years she had fought her own way in a rough world and made the best of circumstances. Healthy, full-blooded, tough, affectionate, romantic, but honest in her way, she was well fitted to meet the ups and downs of life, to keep her head above the waters of a turbulent age, and to pay back as much as she received from man or woman. Yet those long hours which she passed alone in the high-turret chamber, waiting till they summoned her to play the part of a false bride, were the worst that she had ever spent. She knew that her position was, in a sense, shameful, and like to end in tragedy, and, now that she faced it in cold blood, began to wonder why she had chosen to do so. She had fallen in love with the Spaniard almost at first sight, though it is true that something like this had happened to her before with other men. Then he had played his part with her till, quite deceived, she gave all her heart to him in good earnest, believing in her infatuation that, notwithstanding the difference of their place and rank, he desired to make her his wife for her own sake. Afterwards came that bitter day of disillusion when she learned, as Inez had said to Castell, that she was but a stalking heifer used for the taking of the White Swan, her cousin and mistress. That day when she had been beguiled by the letter which was still hid in her garments, and for her pains heard herself called a fool to her face. In her heart she had sworn to be avenged upon Morella then, and now the hour had come in which to fulfil her oath, and pay him back trick for cruel trick. Did she still love the man? She could not say. He was pleasing to her, as he had always been, and when that is so, women forgive much. This was certain, however. Love was not her guide to-night. Was it vengeance, then, that led her on? Perhaps. At least she longed to be able to say to him, "See what craft lies hid even in the bosom of an outwitted fool." Yet she would not have done it for vengeance' sake alone, or rather she would have paid herself in some other fashion. No, her real reason was that she must discharge the debt due to Margaret and Peter, and to Castell, who had sheltered her for years. She it was who had brought them into all this woe, and it seemed but just that she should bring them out again, even at the cost of her own life and womanly dignity. Or, perchance, all three of these powers drove her on: love for the man, if it still lingered, the desire to be avenged upon him, and the desire to snatch his prey from out his maw. At least she had set the game, and she would play it out to its end, however awful that might be. The sun sank, the darkness closed about her, and she wondered whether ever again she would see the dawn. Her brave heart quailed a little, and she gripped the dagger hilt beneath her splendid borrowed robe, thinking to herself that perhaps it might be wisest to drive it into her own breast, and not wait until a balked madman did that office for her. Yet not so, for it is always time to die when one must. A knock came at the door, and her courage, which had sunk so low, burned up again within her. Oh, she would teach this Spaniard that the Englishwoman, whom he had made believe was his desired mistress, could be his master. At any rate, he should hear the truth before the end. She unlocked the door, and Inez entered bearing a lamp, by the light of which she scanned her with her quiet eyes. "The bridegroom is ready," she said slowly, that Betty might understand, "and sends me to lead you to him. Are you afraid?" "Not I," answered Betty. "But tell me, how will the thing be done?" "The marquis meets us in the anteroom to that hall which is used as a chapel, and there, on behalf of the household, I, as the first of the women, give you both the cups of wine. Be sure that you drink of that which I hold in my left hand, passing the cup up beneath your veil so as not to show your face, and speak no word, lest he should recognize your voice. Then we shall go into the chapel, where the priest Henriques waits, also all the household. But that hall is great, and the lamps are feeble, so none will know you there. By this time, also, the drugged wine will have begun to work upon Morella's brain, wherefore, provided that you use a low voice, you may safely say, 'I, Betty, wed thee, Carlos,' not 'I, Margaret, wed thee.' Then, when it is over, he will lead you away to the chambers prepared for you, where, if there is any virtue in my wine, he will sleep sound tonight, that is, as soon as the priest has given me the marriage lines, whereof I will hand you one copy, and keep the others. Afterwards—" and she shrugged her shoulders. "What becomes of you?" asked Betty, when she had fully mastered these instructions. "Oh, I and the priest start tonight for a ride together to Seville, where his money awaits him. Ill company for a woman who means henceforth to be honest and rich, but better than none. Perhaps we shall meet again there, or perhaps we shall not. At least you know where to seek me and the others, at the house of Señor Bernaldez. Now it is time. Are you ready to be made Marchioness of Spain?" "Of course," answered Betty coolly, and they started. Through the empty halls and corridors they went, and oh, surely no Eastern plot that had been conceived in them was quite so bold and desperate as theirs. They reached the antechamber to the chapel, and took their stand outside of the circle of light that fell from its hanging lamps. Presently a door opened, and through it came Morella, attended by two of his secretaries. He was splendidly arrayed in his usual garb of black velvet, and about his neck hung chains of gold and jewels, and to his breast were fastened the glittering stars and orders pertaining to his rank. Never, or so thought Betty, had Morella seemed more magnificent and handsome. He was happy also, who was about to drink of that cup of joy which he so earnestly desired. Yes, his face showed that he was happy, and Betty, noting it, felt remorse stirring in her breast. Low he bowed before her, while she curtsied to him, bending her tall and graceful form till her knee almost touched the ground. Then he came to her and whispered in her ear. "Most sweet, most beloved," he said, "I thank Heaven that has led me to this joyous hour by many a rough and dangerous path. Most dear, again I beseech you to forgive all the sorrow and the ill that I have brought upon you, remembering that it was done for your adored sake, that I love you as woman has been seldom loved, you and only you, and that to you and only you will I cling until my death's day. Oh, do not tremble and shrink, for I swear that no woman in Spain shall have a better or more loyal lord. You I will cherish alone, for you I will strive by night and day to lift you to great honour and satisfy your every wish. Many and pleasant may the years be that we shall spend side by side, and peaceful our ends when at last we lay us down side by side to sleep a while, and wake again in heaven, whereof the shadow lies on me to-night. Remembering the past, I do not ask much of you, as yet. Still, if you are minded to give me a bridal gift that I shall prize above crowns or empires, say that you forgive me all that I have done amiss, and in token lift that veil of yours and kiss me on the lips." Betty heard this speech, whereof she only fully understood the end, and trembled. This was a trial that she had not foreseen. Yet it must be faced, for speak she dared not. Therefore, gathering up her courage, and remembering that the light was on her back, after a little pause, as though of modesty and reluctance, she raised the pearl-embroidered veil, and bending forward beneath its shadow, suffered Morella to kiss her on the lips. It was over, the veil had fallen again, and the man suspected nothing. I am a good artist, thought Inez to herself, and that woman acts better than the wooden Peter. Scarcely could I have done it so well myself. Then the jealousy and hate that she could not control glittering in her soft eyes, for she too had loved this man as well, Inez lifted the golden cups that had been prepared, and gliding forward, beautiful in her broidered Eastern robe, fell upon her knee and handed them to the bridegroom and the bride. Morella took that from her right hand, and Betty that from her left, nor, intoxicated as he was already with that first kiss of love, did he pause to note the evil purpose which was written on the face of his discarded slave. Betty, passing the cup beneath her veil, touched it with her lips, and returned it to Inez, but Morella, exclaiming, "I drink to you, sweet bride, most fair and adored of women," drained his to the dregs, and cast it back to Inez as a gift in such fashion that the red wine which clung to its rim stained her white robes like a splash of blood. Humbly she bowed, humbly she gathered the precious vessel from the floor, but when she rose again there was triumph in her eyes, not hate. Now Morella took his bride's hand, and, followed by his gentlemen and Inez, walked to the curtains that were drawn as they came into the great hall beyond, where had mustered all his household, perhaps 100 of them. Between their bowing ranks they passed, a stately pair, and while sweet voices sang behind some hidden screen, walked onward to the altar where stood the waiting priest. They kneeled down upon the gold-embroidered cushions, while the office of the church was read over them. The ring was set upon Betty's hand. Scarce, it would seem, could he find her finger. The man took the woman to wife, the woman took the man for husband. His voice was thick, and hers was very low. Of all that listening crowd none could hear the names they spoke. It was over. The priest bowed and blessed them. They signed some papers, there by the light of the altar candles. Father Henriques filled in certain names, and signed them also, then, casting sand upon them, placed them in the outstretched hand of Inez, who, although Morella never seemed to notice, gave one to the bride, and thrust the other 2 into the bosom of her robe. Then both she and the priest kissed the hands of the Marquis and his wife, and asked his leave to be gone. He bowed his head vaguely, and, if they had been there to listen, within 10 short minutes they might have heard 2 horses galloping hard toward the Seville gate. Now, escorted by pages and torch-bearers, the new-wed pair repassed those dim and stately halls, the bride veiled, mysterious, fateful, the bridegroom empty-eyed, like one who wanders in his sleep. Thus they reached their chamber, and its carved doors shut behind them. It was early morning, and the serving women who waited without that room were summoned to it by the sound of a silver gong. 2 of them entered and were met by Betty, no longer veiled, but wrapped in a loose robe, who said to them, "My lord the Marquis still sleeps. Come, help me dress and make ready his bath and food." The women stared at her, for now that she had washed the paint from her face they knew well that this was the Señora Betty, and not the Dona Margaret, whom they had understood the Marquis was to marry. But she chid them sharply in her bad Spanish, bidding them be swift, as she would be robed before her husband should awake. So they obeyed her, and when she was ready she went with them into the great hall, where many of the household were gathered, waiting to do homage to the new-wed pair, and greeted them all, blushing and smiling, saying that doubtless the Marquis would be among them soon, and commanding them meanwhile to go about their several tasks. So well did Betty play her part indeed, that although they also were bewildered, none questioned her place or authority, who remembered that after all they had not been told by their lord himself which of these 2 English ladies he meant to marry. Also she distributed among the meaner of them a present of money on her husband's behalf and her own, and then ate food and drank some wine before them all, pledging them and receiving their salutations and good wishes. When all this was done, still smiling, Betty returned to the marriage chamber, closing its door behind her, sat down on a chair near the bed, and waited for the worst struggle of all, that struggle on which hung her life. See! Morella stirred. He sat up, gazing about him and rubbing his brow. Presently his eyes lit upon Betty, seated stern and upright in her high chair. She rose, and, coming to him, kissed him and called him husband, and, still half asleep, he kissed her back. Then she sat down again in her chair, and watched his face. It changed, and changed again. Wonder, fear, amaze, bewilderment flitted over it, till at last he said in English, "Betty, where is my wife?" "Here," answered Betty. He stared at her. "Nay, I mean the Donna Margaret, your cousin and my lady, whom I wed last night. And how come you here? I thought that you had left Granada." Betty looked astonished. "I do not understand you," she answered. "It was my cousin Margaret who left Granada. I stayed here to be married to you, as you arranged with me through Inez." His jaw dropped. "Arranged with you through Inez? Mother of heaven, what do you mean?" "Mean?" she answered. "I mean what I say. Surely," and she rose in indignation, "you have never dared to try to play some new trick upon me." "Trick!" muttered Morella. "What says the woman? Is all this a dream, or am I mad?" "A dream, I think. Yes, it must be a dream, since certainly it was to no madman that I was wed last night. Look!" and she held before him that writing of marriage, signed by the priest, by him, and by herself, which stated that Carlos, Marquis of Morella, was on such a date, at Granada, duly married to the Señora Elizabeth Dean of London in England. He read it twice, then sank back gasping, while Betty hid away the parchment in her bosom. Then presently he seemed to go mad indeed. He raved, he cursed, he ground his teeth, he looked round for a sword to kill her or himself, but could find none. And all the while Betty sat still and gazed at him like some living fate. At length he was weary, and her turn came. "Listen," she said. "Yonder in London you promised to marry me. I have it hidden away, and in your own writing. By agreement I fled with you to Spain. By the mouth of your messenger and former love this marriage was arranged between us, I receiving your messages to me and sending back mine to you, since you explained that for reasons of your own you did not wish to speak of these matters before my cousin Margaret, and could not wed me until she and her father and her lover were gone from Granada. So I bade them farewell and stayed here alone for love of you, as I fled from London for love of you, and last night we were united, as all your household know, for but now I have eaten with them and received their good wishes. And now you dare to tell me that I, your wife, I who have sacrificed everything for you, I, the Marchioness of Morella, am not your wife? Well, go, say it outside this chamber, and hear your very slaves cry shame upon you. Go, say it to your king and your bishops, aye, and to his holiness the Pope himself, and listen to their answer. Why, great as you are, and rich as you are, they will hale you to a madhouse or a prison." Morella listened, rocking himself to and fro upon the bed, then with an oath sprang towards her, to be met by a dagger point glinting in his eyes. "Hear me again," she said as he shrank back from that cold steel. "I am no slave and no weakling. You shall not murder me or thrust me away. I am your wife and your equal, aye, and stronger than you in body and in mind, and I will have my rights in the face of God and man." "Certainly," he said with a kind of unwilling admiration, "certainly you are no weakling. Certainly also you have paid back all you owe me with a Jew's interest. Or mayhap you are not so clever as I think, but just a strong-minded fool, and it is that accursed Inez who has settled her debts. Oh, to think of it!" and he shook his fist in the air. "To think that I believed myself married to the Donna Margaret, and find you in her place. You!" "Be silent," she said, "you man without shame, who first fly at the throat of your new wedded wife, and then insult her by saying that you wish you were wedded to another woman. Be silent, or I will unlock the door and call your own people and repeat your monstrous talk to them." And she drew herself to her full height and stood over him on the bed. Morella, his first rage spent, looked at her reflectively, and not without a certain measure of homage. "I think," he remarked, "that if he did not happen to be in love with another woman, and to believe that he had married her, you, my good Betty, would make a useful wife to any man who wished to get on in the world. I understood you to say that the door is locked, and if I might hazard a guess, you have the key, as also you happen to have a dagger. Well, I find the air in this place close, and I want to go out." "Where to?" asked Betty. "Let us say, to join Inez." "What?" she asked. "Would you already be running after that woman again? Do you already forget that you are married?" "It seems that I am not to be allowed to forget it. Now, let us bargain. I wish to leave Granada for a while, and without scandal. What are your terms? Remember that there are two to which I will not consent. I will not stop here with you, and you shall not accompany me. Remember also that, although you hold the dagger at present, it is not wise of you to try to push this jest too far." "As you did when you decoyed me on board the San Antonio," said Betty. "Well, our honeymoon has not begun too sweetly, and I do not mind if you go away for a while, to look for Inez. Swear now that you mean me no harm, and that you will not plot my death or disgrace, or in any way interfere with my liberty or position here in Granada. Swear it on the rood." And she took down a silver crucifix that hung upon the wall over the bed and handed it to him, for she knew Morella's superstitions, and that if once he swore upon this symbol he dare not break his oath. "And if I will not swear?" he asked sullenly. "Then," she answered, "you stop here until you do, you who are anxious to be gone. I have eaten food this morning, you have not. I have a dagger, you have none. And, being as we are, I am sure that no one will venture to disturb us until Inez and her friend the priest have gone further than you can follow." "Very well, I will swear," he said, and he kissed the crucifix and threw it down. "You can stop here and rule my house in Granada, and I will do you no mischief, nor trouble you in any way. But if you come out of Granada, then we cross swords." "You mean that you intend to leave this city? Then here is paper and ink. Be so good as to sign an order to the stewards of your estates, within the territories of the Moorish king, to pay all their revenue to me during your absence, and to your servants to obey me in everything." "It is easy to see you were brought up in the house of a Jew merchant," said Morella, biting the pen and considering this woman who, whether she were hawk or pigeon, knew so well how to feather her nest. "Well, if I grant you this position and these revenues, will you leave me alone and cease to press other claims upon me?" Now Betty, bethinking her of those papers that Inez had carried away with her, and that Castell and Margaret would know well how to use them if there were need, bethinking her also that if she pushed him too far at the beginning she might die suddenly, as folk sometimes did in Granada, answered, "It is much to ask of a deluded woman, but I still have some pride, and will not thrust myself in where it seems I am not wanted. Therefore, so be it. Till you seek me or send for me, I will not seek you so long as you keep your bargain. Now write the paper, sign it, and call in your secretaries to witness the signature." "In whose favour must I word it?" "In that of the Marquesa of Morella," she answered, and he, seeing a loophole in the words, obeyed her, since if she were not his wife this writing would have no value. Somehow he must be rid of this woman. Of course he might cause her to be killed, but even in Granada people could not kill one to whom they had seemed to be just married, without questions being asked. Moreover, Betty had friends, and he had enemies, who would certainly ask them if she vanished away. No, he would sign the paper and fight the case afterwards, for he had no time to lose. Margaret had slipped away from him, and if once she escaped from Spain he knew that he would never see her more. For aught he knew, she might already have escaped or be married to Peter Brome. The very thought of it filled him with madness. There had been conspiracy against him. He was outwitted, robbed, befooled. Well, hope still remained, and vengeance. He could still fight Peter, and perhaps kill him. He could hand over Castell, the Jew, to the Inquisition. He could find a way to deal with the priest Henriques and the woman Inez, and perhaps, if fortune favoured him, he could get Margaret back into his power. Oh yes, he would sign anything, if only thereby he was set at liberty, and freed for a while from this servant who called herself his wife, this strong-minded, strong-bodied, clever Englishwoman, of whom he had thought to make a tool, and who had made a tool of him. So Betty dictated, and he wrote. Yes, it had come to this. She dictated, and he wrote, and signed too. The order was comprehensive. It gave power to the most honourable Marquesa of Morella to act for him, her husband, in all things during his absence from Granada. It commanded that all rents and profits due to him should be paid to her, and that all his servants and dependents should obey her as though she were himself, and that her receipt should be as good as his receipt. When the paper was written, and Betty had spelt it over carefully to see that there was no omission or mistake, she unlocked the door, struck upon the gong, and summoned the secretaries to witness their lord's signature to a settlement. Presently they came, bowing, and offering many felicitations, which to himself Morella vowed he would remember against them. "I have to go a journey," he said. "Witness my signature to this document, which provides for the carrying on of my household and the disposal of my property during my absence." They stared and bowed. "Read it aloud first," said Betty, "so that my lord and husband may be sure that there is no mistake." One of them obeyed, but before ever he had finished the furious Morella shouted to him from the bed. "Have done and witness, then go. Order me horses and an escort, for I ride at once." So they witnessed in a great hurry, and left the room. Betty left with them, holding the paper in her hand, and when she reached the large hall where the household were gathered, waiting to greet their lord, she commanded one of the secretaries to read it out to all of them, also to translate it into the Moorish tongue that everyone might understand. Then she hid it away with the marriage lines, and, seating herself in the midst of the household, ordered them to prepare to receive the most noble Marquis. They had not long to wait, for presently he came out of the room like a bull into the arena, whereon Betty rose and curtsied to him, and at her word all his servants bowed themselves down in the Eastern fashion. For a moment he paused, again like the bull when he sees the picadors and is about to charge. Then he thought better of it, and, with a muttered curse, strode past them. 10 minutes later, for the third time within 24 hours, horses galloped from the palace and through the Seville gate. "Friends," said Betty in her awkward Spanish, when she knew that he had gone, "a sad thing has happened to my husband, the Marquis. The woman Inez, whom it seems he trusted very much, has departed, stealing a treasure that he valued above everything on earth, and so I, his new-made wife, am left desolate while he tries to find her." End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Fair Margaret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Fair Margaret by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 20. Isabella of Spain. On the afternoon following his first visit, Castell's agent, Bernaldez, arrived again at the prison of the Hermandad at Sevilla, accompanied by a tailor, a woman, and a chest full of clothes. The governor ordered these two persons to wait while the garments were searched under his own eye, but Bernaldez he permitted to be led at once to the prisoners. As soon as he was with them, he said, "Your Marquis has been married fast enough." "How do you know that?" asked Castell. "From the woman Inez, who arrived with the priest last night and gave me the certificates of his union with Betty Dene, signed by himself. I have not brought them with me, lest I should be searched, when they might have been taken away. But Inez has come disguised as a sempstress, so show no surprise when you see her, if she is admitted. Perhaps she will be able to tell the Donna Margaret something of what passed, if she is allowed to fit her robes alone. After that she must lie hidden for fear of the vengeance of Morella. But I shall know where to put my hand upon her if she is wanted. You will all of you be brought before the Queen tomorrow, and then I, who shall be there, will produce the writings." Scarcely were the words out of his mouth when the governor appeared, and with him the tailor and Inez, who curtsied and glanced at Margaret out of the corners of her soft eyes, looking at them all as though with curiosity, like one who had never seen or heard of them before. When the dresses had been produced, Margaret asked whether she might be allowed to try them on with the woman in her own chamber, as she had not been measured for them. The governor answered that as both the sempstress and the robes had been searched, there was no objection, so the two of them retired, Inez with her arms full of garments. "Tell me all about it," whispered Margaret, as soon as the door was closed. "I die to hear your story." So, while she fitted the clothes, since in that place they could never be sure but that they were watched through some secret loophole, Inez, with her mouth full of aloe thorns, which those of the trade used as pins, told her everything, down to the time of her escape from Granada. When she came to that part of the tale where the false bride had lifted her veil and kissed the bridegroom, Margaret gasped in her amaze. "Oh, how could she do it?" she said. "I should have fainted first." "She has a good courage, that Betty. Turn to the light, please, Señora. And I could not have acted better myself. I think it is a little high on the left shoulder. He never guessed a thing, the besotted fool, and that was before I gave him the wine, for he wasn't likely to guess much afterwards." "Did the Señora say it was tight under the arm?" "Well, perhaps a little, but this stuff stretches. What I want to know is, what happened afterwards? Your cousin is the bull that I put my money on. I believe she will clear the ring. A woman with a nerve of steel. Had I as much, I should have been the Marchioness of Morella long ago. Or there would be another Marquis by now. There, the sit of the skirt is perfect. The Señora's beautiful figure looks even more beautiful in it than ever. Well, whoever lives will learn all about it, and it is no use worrying. Meanwhile, Bernaldez has paid me the money, and a handsome sum too, so you needn't thank me. I only worked for hire, and hate. Now I am going to lie low, as I don't want to get my throat cut, but he can find me if I am really needed." "The priest? Oh, he is safe enough. We made him sign a receipt for his cash. Also, I believe that he has got his post as a secretary to the Inquisition, and began his duties at once, as they were short-handed, torturing Jews and heretics, you know, and stealing their goods, both of which occupations will exactly suit him. I rode with him all the way to Seville, and he tried to make love to me, the slimy knave, but I paid him out." And Inez smiled at some pleasant recollection. "Still, I did not quarrel with him outright, as he may come in useful. Who knows? There's the governor calling me. One moment, Excellency, only one moment." "Yes, Señora. With those few alterations the dress will be perfect. You shall have it back tonight without fail, and I can cut the others that you have been pleased to order from the same pattern." "Oh, I thank you, Señora. You are too good to a poor girl, and," in a whisper, "the Mother of God have you in her guard, and send that Peter has improved in his love-making." And, half hidden in garments, Inez bowed herself out of the room through the door which the governor had already opened. About 9 o'clock on the following morning, one of the jailers came to summon Margaret and her father to be led before the court. Margaret asked anxiously if the Señor Brome was coming too, but the man replied that he knew nothing of the Señor Brome, as he was in one of the cells for dangerous criminals, which he did not serve. So forth they went, dressed in their new clothes, which were as fine as money could buy, and in the latest Seville fashion, and were conducted to the courtyard. Here, to her joy, Margaret saw Peter waiting for them under guard, and dressed also in the Christian garments which they had begged might be supplied to him at their cost. She sprang to his side, none hindering her, and, forgetting her bashfulness, suffered him to embrace her before them all, asking him how he had fared since they were parted. "None too well," answered Peter gloomily, who did not know if we should ever meet again. "Also, my prison is underground, where but little light comes through a grating, and there are rats in it which will not let a man sleep, so I must lie awake the most of the night thinking of you. But where go we now?" "To be put upon our trial before the Queen, I think. Hold my hand and walk close beside me, but do not stare at me so hard. Is aught wrong with my dress?" "Nothing," answered Peter. "I stare because you look so beautiful in it. Could you not have worn a veil? Doubtless there are more marquises about this court." "Only the Moors wear veils, Peter, and now we are Christians again. Listen, I think that none of them understand English. I have seen Inez, who asked after you very tenderly. Nay, do not blush, it is unseemly in a man. Have you seen her also?" "No. Well, she escaped from Granada as she planned, and Betty is married to the Marquis." "It will never hold good," answered Peter, shaking his head, "being but a trick, and I fear that she will pay for it, poor woman. Still, she gave us a start, though, so far as prisons go. I was better off in Granada than in that rat trap." "Yes," answered Margaret innocently. "You had a garden to walk in there, had you not? No, don't be angry with me. Do you know what Betty did?" And she told him of how she had lifted her veil and kissed Morella without being discovered. "That isn't so wonderful," said Peter, "since if they are painted up young women look very much alike in a half-lit room." "Or garden," suggested Margaret. "What is wonderful," went on Peter, scorning to take note of this interruption, "is that she could consent to kiss the man at all. The double-dealing scoundrel! Has Inez told you how he treated her? The very thought of it makes me ill." "Well, Peter, he didn't ask you to kiss him, did he? And as for the wrongs of Inez, though doubtless you know more about them than I do, I think she has given him an orange for his pomegranate. But look, there is the Alcazar in front of us. Is it not a splendid castle? You know it was built by the Moors." "I don't care who it was built by," said Peter, "and it looks to me like any other castle, only larger. All I know about it is that I am to be tried there for knocking that ruffian on the head, and that perhaps this is the last time we shall see of each other, as probably they will send me to the galleys, if they don't do worse." "Oh, say no such thing! I never thought of it. It is not possible," answered Margaret, her dark eyes filling with tears. "Wait till your Marquis appears, pleading the case against us, and you will see what is or is not possible," replied Peter with conviction. "Still, we have come through some storms, so let us hope for the best." At that moment they reached the gate of the Alcazar, which they had approached from their prison through gardens of orange trees, and soldiers came up and separated them. Next they were led across a court, where many people hurried to and fro, into a great marble-columned room, glittering with gold, which was called the Hall of Justice. At the far end of this place, seated on a throne set upon a richly carpeted dais, and surrounded by lords and councillors, sat a magnificently attired lady of middle age. She was blue-eyed and red-haired, with a fair-skinned, open countenance, but very reserved and quiet in her demeanour. "The Queen," muttered the guard, saluting, as did Castell and Peter, while Margaret curtsied. A case had just been tried, and the Queen Isabella, after consultation with her assessors, was delivering judgment in few words and gentle voice. As she spoke, her mild blue eyes fell upon Margaret, and, held it would seem by her beauty, rested on her till they wandered off to the tall form of Peter, and the dark, Jewish-looking Castell by him, at the sight of whom she frowned a little. That case was finished, and other suitors stood up in their turn, but the Queen, waving her hand and still looking at Margaret, bent down and asked a question of one of the officers of the court, then gave an order, whereupon the officer rising summoned John Castell, Margaret Castell, and Peter Brome, all of England, to appear at the bar and answer to the charge of murder of one Louis of Bassa, a soldier of the Holy Hermandad. At once they were brought forward and stood in a line in front of the dais, while the officer began to read the charge against them. "Stay, friend," interposed the Queen. "These accused are the subjects of our good brother Henry of England, and may not understand our language, though one of them, I think," and she glanced at Castell, "was not born in England, or at any rate of English blood. Ask them if they need an interpreter." The question was put, and all of them answered that they could speak Spanish, though Peter added that he did so, but indifferently. "You are the knight, I think, who is charged with the commission of this crime," said Isabella, looking at him. "Your Majesty, I am not a knight, but a plain esquire, Peter Brome of Dedham in England. My father was a knight, Sir Peter Brome, but he fell at my side, fighting for Richard, on Bosworth Field, where I had this wound," and he pointed to the scar upon his face, "but was not knighted for my pains." Isabella smiled a little, then asked, "And how came you to Spain, Señor Peter Brome?" "Your Majesty," answered Peter, Margaret helping from time to time when he did not know the Spanish words, "this lady at my side, the daughter of the merchant John Castell who stands by her, is my affianced." "Then you have won the love of a very beautiful maiden, Señor," interrupted the Queen, "but proceed." "She and her cousin, the Señora Dene, were kidnapped in London by one who I understand is the nephew of the King Ferdinand, and an envoy to the English court, who passed there as the Señor de Aguilar, but who in Spain is the Marquis of Morella." "Kidnapped! And by Morella!" exclaimed the Queen. "Yes, your Majesty, cozened on board his ship and disappeared. The Señor Castell and I followed them, and boarding their vessel, tried to rescue them, but were shipwrecked at Motril. The Marquis carried them away to Granada, whither we followed also, I being sorely hurt in the shipwreck. There, in the palace of the Marquis, we have lain prisoners many weeks, but at length escaped, purposing to come to Seville and seek the protection of your Majesties. On the road, while we were dressed as Moors, in which garb we compassed our escape, we were attacked by men that we thought were bandits, for we had been warned against such evil people. One of them rudely molested the Donna Margaret, and I cut him down, and by misfortune killed him, for which manslaughter I am here before you today. Your Majesty, I did not know that he was a soldier of the Holy Hermandad, and I pray you pardon my offence, which was done in ignorance, fear, and anger, for we are willing to pay compensation for this unhappy death. I cut him down, and by misfortune killed him." Now some in the court exclaimed, "Well spoken, Englishman." Then the Queen said, "If all this tale be true, I am not sure that we should blame you overmuch, Señor Brome. But how know we that it is true? For instance, you said that the noble Marquis stole 2 ladies, a deed of which I can scarcely think him capable. Where then is the other?" "I believe," answered Peter, "that she is now the wife of the Marquis of Morella." "The wife? Who bears witness that she is the wife? He has not advised us that he was about to marry, as is usual." Then Bernaldez stood forward, stating his name and occupation, and that he was a correspondent of the English merchant John Castell, and producing the certificate of marriage signed by Morella, Betty, and the priest Henriques, handed it up to the Queen, saying that he had received them in duplicate by a messenger from Granada, and had delivered the other to the Archbishop of Seville. The Queen, having looked at the paper, passed it to her assessors, who examined it very carefully, one of them saying that the form was not usual, and that it might be forged. The Queen thought a little while, then said, "That is so, and in one way only can we know the truth. Let our warrant issue summoning before us our cousin, the noble Marquis of Morella, the Señora Dene, who is said to be his wife, and the priest Henriques of Motril, who is said to have married them. When they have arrived, all of them, the King, my husband, and I will examine into the matter, and until then we will not suffer our minds to be prejudiced by hearing any more of this cause." Now the governor of the prison stood forward and asked what was to be done with the captives until the witnesses could be brought from Granada. The Queen answered that they must remain in his charge and be well treated, whereupon Peter prayed that he might be given a better cell with fewer rats and more light. The Queen smiled and said that it should be so, but added that it would be proper that he should still be kept apart from the lady to whom he was affianced, who could dwell with her father. Then, noting the sadness on their faces, she added, "Yes, I think they may meet daily in the garden of the prison." Margaret curtsied and thanked her, whereupon she said very graciously, "Come here, Señora, and sit by me a little," and she pointed to a footstool at her side. When I have done this business, I desire a few words with you." So Margaret was brought up upon the dais, and sat down at her Majesty's left hand, upon the broidered footstool, and very fair indeed she looked placed thus above the crowd, she whose beauty and whose bearing were so royal. But Castell and Peter were led away back to the prison, though, seeing so many gay lords about, the latter went unwillingly enough. A while later, when the cases were finished, the Queen dismissed the court, save for certain officers, who stood at a distance, and, turning to Margaret, said, "Now, fair maiden, tell me your story, as one woman to another, and do not fear that anything you say will be made use of at the trial of your lover, since against you, at any rate, at present, no charge is laid. Say first, are you really the affianced of that tall gentleman, and has he really your heart?" "All of it, your Majesty," answered Margaret, "and we have suffered much for each other's sake." Then, in as few words as she could, she told their tale, while the Queen listened earnestly. "A strange story indeed, and if it be all true, a shameful," she said when Margaret had finished. "But how comes it that if Morella desired to force you into marriage, he is now wed to your companion and cousin? What are you keeping back from me?" And she glanced at her shrewdly. "Your Majesty," answered Margaret, "I was ashamed to speak the rest, yet I will trust you and do so, praying your royal forgiveness if you hold that we, who were in desperate straits, have done what is wrong. My cousin, Betty Dene, has paid back Marilla in his own false gold. He won her heart, and promised to marry her, and at the risk of her own life she took my place at the altar, thereby securing our escape." "A brave deed, if a doubtful," said the Queen, "though I question whether such a marriage will be upheld. But that is a matter for the Church to judge of, and I must speak of it no more. Certainly it is hard to be angry with any of you. What did you say that Morella promised you when he asked you to marry him in London?" "Your Majesty, he promised that he would lift me high, perhaps even," and she hesitated, "to that seat in which you sit." Isabella frowned, then laughed, and said, as she looked her up and down, "You would fit it well, better than I do, in truth. But what else did he say?" "Your Majesty, he said that not everyone loves the king, his uncle, and that he had many friends who remembered that his father was poisoned by the father of the king, who was Morella's grandfather, also that his mother was a princess of the Moors, and that he might throw in his lot with theirs, or that there were other ways in which he could gain his end." "So, said the Queen. "Well, though he is such a good son of the Church, and my lord is so fond of him, I never loved Morella, and I thank you for your warning. But I must not speak to you of such high matters, though it seems that some have thought otherwise. Fair Margaret, have you aught to ask of me?" "Yes, your Majesty, that you will deal gently with my true love when he comes before you for trial, remembering that he is hot of head and strong of arm, and that such knights as he, for knightly is his blood, cannot brook to see their ladies mishandled by rough men, and the wrappings that shield them torn from off their bosoms. Also I pray that I may be protected from Morella, that he may not be allowed to touch or even to speak to me, who, for all his rank and splendour, hate him as though he were some poisoned snake." "I have said that I must not prejudge your case, you beautiful English Margaret," the Queen answered with a smile, "yet I think that neither of those things you ask will cause justice to slip the bandage that is about her eyes. Go and be at peace. If you have spoken truth to me, as I am sure you have, and Isabella of Spain can prevent it, the Signor Brome's punishment shall not be heavy, nor shall the shadow of the Marquis of Morella, the base-born son of a prince and of some royal infidel." These words she spoke with much bitterness. "So much as fall upon you, though I warn you that my lord the king loves the man, as is but natural, and will not condemn him lightly. Tell me one thing, this lover of yours is brave, is he not?" "Very brave," answered Margaret, smiling. "And he can ride a horse and hold a lance, can he not, at any rate in your quarrel?" "Ay, your Majesty, and wield a sword too, as well as most knights, though he has been but lately sick. Some learned that on Bosworth Field." "Good. Now farewell." And she gave Margaret her hand to kiss. Then, calling 2 of her officers, she bade them conduct her back to the prison, and say that she should have liberty to send messages or to write to her, the Queen, if she should so desire. On the night of that same day Morella galloped into Seville. Indeed, he should have been there long before, but misled by the story of the Moors who had escorted Peter, Margaret, and her father out of Granada, and seen them take the Malaga road, he travelled thither first, only to find no trace of them in that city. Then he returned and tracked them to Seville, where he was soon made acquainted with all that had happened. Amongst other things, he discovered that 10 hours before swift messengers had been dispatched to Granada, commanding his attendance, and that of Betty, with whom he had gone through the form of marriage. On the following morning he asked an audience with the Queen, but it was refused to him, and the King his uncle was away. Next he tried to win admission into the prison to see Margaret, only to find that neither his high rank and authority nor any bribe would suffice to unlock its doors. The Queen had commanded otherwise, he was informed, and knew therefrom that in this matter he must reckon with Isabella as an enemy. Then he bethought him of revenge, and began a search for Inez and the priest Henriques of Motril, only to find that the former had vanished, none knew whither, and the Holy Father was safe within the walls of the Inquisition, whence he was careful not to emerge, and where no layman, however highly placed, could enter to lay a hand upon one of its officers. So, full of rage and disappointment, he took counsel of lawyers and friends, and prepared to defend the suit which he saw would be brought against him, hoping that chance might yet deliver Margaret into his hands. One good card he held, which now he determined to play. Castell, as he knew, was a Jew, who for years had posed as a Christian, and for such there was no mercy in Seville. Perhaps for her father's sake he might yet be able to work upon Margaret, whom now he desired to win more fiercely than ever before. At least it was certain that he would try this, or any other means, however base, rather than see her married to his rival, Peter Brome. Also there was the chance that this Peter might be condemned to imprisonment or even to death for the killing of a soldier of the Hermandad. So Morella made him ready for the great struggle as best he could, and, since he could not stop her coming, awaited the arrival of Betty in Seville. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of Fair Margaret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fair Margaret by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 21. Betty states her case. 7 days had passed, during which time Margaret and her father had rested quietly in the prison, where, indeed, they dwelt more as guests than as captives. Thus they were allowed to receive what visitors they would, and among them Juan Bernaldez, Castell's connection and agent, who told them of all that passed without. Through him they sent messengers to meet Betty on her road and apprise her of how things stood and of the trial in which her cause would be judged. Soon the messengers returned, stating that the Marchioness of Morella was travelling in state, accompanied by a great retinue, that she thanked them for their tidings and hoped to be able to defend herself at all points. At this news Castell stared and Margaret laughed, for, although she did not know all the story, she was sure that in some way Betty had the mastery of Morella, and would not be easily defeated, though how she came to be travelling with a great retinue she could not imagine. Still, fearing lest she should be attacked or otherwise injured, she wrote a humble letter to the Queen, praying that her cousin might be defended from all danger at the hands of anyone whomsoever, until she had an opportunity of giving evidence before their majesties. Within an hour came the answer that the lady was under the royal protection, and that a guard had been sent to escort her and her party and to keep her safe from interference of any sort. Also that for her greater comfort quarters had been prepared for her in a fortress outside of Seville, which would be watched night and day, and whence she would be brought to the court. Peter was still kept apart from them, but each day at noon they were allowed to meet him in the walled garden of the prison, where they talked together to their heart's content. Here, too, he exercised himself daily at all manly games, and especially at sword-play with some of the other prisoners, using sticks for swords. Further, he was allowed the use of his horse that he had ridden from Granada, on which he jousted in the yard of the castle with the governor and certain other gentlemen, proving himself better at that play than any of them. These things he did vigorously and with ardour, for Margaret had told him of the hint which the Queen gave her, and he desired to get back his full strength and to perfect himself in the handling of every arm which was used in Spain. So the time went by until one afternoon the governor informed them that Peter's trial was fixed for the morrow, and that they must accompany him to the court to be examined also upon all these matters. A little later came Bernaldes, who said that the king had returned and would sit with the queen, and that already this affair had made much stir in Seville, where there was much curiosity as to the story of Morella's marriage, of which many different tales were told. That Margaret and her father would be discharged, he had little doubt, in which case their ship was ready for them, but of Peter's chances he could say nothing, for they depended upon what view the king took of his offence, and, though unacknowledged, Morella was the king's nephew and had his ear. Afterwards they went down into the garden, and there found Peter, who had just returned from his jousting, flushed with exercise and looking very manly and handsome. Margaret took his hand and, walking alongside, told him the news. "I am glad," he answered, "for the sooner this business is begun, the sooner it will be done. But, sweet," and here his face grew very earnest, "Morella has much power in this land, and I have broken its law, so none know what the end will be. I may be condemned to death or imprisoned, or perhaps, if I am given the chance, with better luck I may fall fighting, in any of which cases we shall be separated for a while or altogether. Should this be so, I pray that you will not stay here, either in the hope of rescuing me or for other reasons, since, while you are in Spain, Morella will not cease from his attempts to get hold of you, whereas in England you will be safe from him." When Margaret heard these words, she sobbed aloud, for the thought that harm might come to Peter seemed to choke her. "In all things I will do your bidding," she said. "Yet how can I leave you, dear, while you are alive? And if, perchance, you should die, which may God prevent, how can I live on without you? Rather shall I seek to follow you very swiftly." "I do not desire that," said Peter. "I desire that you should endure your days till the end, and come to meet me where I am in due season, and not before. I will add this, that if in after years you should meet any worthy man, and have a mind to marry him, you should do so, for I know well that you will never forget me, your first love, and that beyond this world lie others where there are no marryings or giving in marriage. Let not my dead hand lie heavy upon you, Margaret." "Yet," she replied in gentle indignation, "heavy must it always lie, since it is about my heart. Be sure of this, Peter, that if such dreadful ill should fall upon us, as you left me, so shall you find me, here or hereafter." "So be it," he said with a sigh of relief, for he could not bear to think of Margaret as the wife of some other man, even after he was gone, although his honest, simple nature, and fear lest her life might be made empty of all joy, caused him to say what he had said. Then behind the shelter of a flowering bush they embraced each other as do those who know not whether they will ever kiss again, and the hour of sunset having come, parted as they must. On the following morning once more Castell and Margaret were led to the Hall of Justice in Alcazar, but this time Peter did not go with them. The great court was already full of councillors, officers, gentlemen, and ladies who had come from curiosity, and other folk connected with or interested in the case. As yet, however, Margaret could not see Morella or Betty, nor had the king and queen taken their seats upon the throne. Peter was already there, standing before the bar with guards on either side of him, and greeted them with a smile and a nod as they were ushered to their chairs near by. Just as they reached them, also trumpets were blown, and from the back of the hall, walking hand in hand, appeared their Majesties of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, whereat all the audience rose and bowed, remaining standing till they were seated on the thrones. The king, whom they now saw for the first time, was a thick-set, active man with pleasant eyes, a fair skin, and a broad forehead, but, as Margaret thought, somewhat sly-faced, the face of a man who never forgot his own interests in those of another. Like the queen, he was magnificently attired in garments broidered with gold and the arms of Aragon, while in his hand he held a golden sceptre surmounted by a jewel, and about his waist, to show that he was a warlike king, he wore his long cross-handled sword. Smilingly he acknowledged the homage of his subjects by lifting his hand to his cap and bowing. Then his eye fell upon the beautiful Margaret, and turning, he put a question to the queen in a light, sharp voice, asking if that were the lady whom Morella had married, and, if so, why in the name of heaven he wished to be rid of her. Isabella answered that she understood that this was the Signora whom he had desired to marry when he married someone else, as he alleged, by mistake, but who was in fact affianced to the prisoner before them, a reply at which all who heard it laughed. At this moment the Marquis of Morella, accompanied by his gentlemen and some long-gowned lawyers, appeared walking up the court, dressed in the black velvet that he always wore, and glittering with orders. Upon his head was a cap, also of black velvet, from which hung a great pearl, and this cap he did not remove even when he bowed to the king and queen, for he was one of the few grandees of Spain who had the right to remain covered before their majesties. They acknowledged his salutation, Ferdinand with a friendly nod, and Isabella with a cold bow, and he too took the seat that had been prepared for him. Just then there was a disturbance at the far end of the court, where one of its officers could be heard calling, "Make way for the Marchioness of Morella." At the sound of this name the Marquis, whose eyes were fixed on Margaret, frowned fiercely, rising from his seat as though to protest, then, at some whispered word from a lawyer behind him, sat down again. Now the crowd of spectators separated, and Margaret, turning to look down the long hall, saw a procession advancing up the lane between them, some clad in armour, and some in white Moorish robes blazoned with the scarlet eagle, the cognizance of Morella. In the midst of them, her train supported by two Moorish women, walked a tall and beautiful lady, a coronet upon her brow, her fair hair outspread, a purple cloak hanging from her shoulders, half hiding that same splendid robe sewn with pearls which had been Morella's gift to Margaret, and about her white bosom the chain of pearls which he had presented to Betty in compensation for her injuries. Margaret stared and stared again, and her father at her side murmured, "It is our Betty. Truly fine feathers make fine birds." Yes, it was Betty without a doubt, though remembering her in her humble woollen dress at the old house in Holborn, it was hard to recognize the poor companion in this proud and magnificent lady, who looked as though all her life she had trodden the marble floors of courts and consorted with nobles and with queens. Up the great hall she came, stately, imperturbable, looking neither to the right nor the left, taking no note of the whisperings about her, no, nor even of Morella or of Margaret, till she reached the open space in front of the bar where Peter and his guards, gazing with all their eyes, hastened to make place for her. There she curtsied thrice, twice to the queen and once to the king, her consort, then, turning, bowed to the marquis, who fixed his eyes upon the ground and took no note, bowed to Castell and Peter, and lastly, advancing to Margaret, gave her her cheek to kiss. This Margaret did with becoming humility, whispering in her ear, "How fares your grace?" "Better than you would in my shoes," whispered Betty back, with ever so slight a trembling of her left eyelid, while Margaret heard the king mutter to the queen, "A fine peacock of a woman. Look at her figure and those big eyes. Morella must be hard to please." "Perhaps he prefers swans to peacocks," answered the queen in the same voice, with a glance at Margaret, whose quieter and more refined beauty seemed to gain by contrast with that of her nobly built and dazzling skinned cousin. Then she motioned to Betty to take the seat prepared for her, which she did, with her suite standing behind her and an interpreter at her side. "I am somewhat bewildered," said the king, glancing from Morella to Betty and from Margaret to Peter, for evidently the humour of the situation did not escape him. "What is the exact case that we have to try?" Then one of the legal assessors, or alcaldes, rose and said that the matter before their majesties was a charge against the Englishman at the bar of killing a certain soldier of the Holy Hermandad, but that there seemed to be other matters mixed up with it. "So I gather," answered the king. "For instance, an accusation of the carrying off of subjects of a friendly power out of the territory of that power, a suit for nullity of a marriage, and a cross suit for the declaration of the validity of the said marriage, and the holy saints know what besides. Well, one thing at a time. Let us try this tall Englishman." So the case was opened against Peter by a public prosecutor, who restated it as it had been laid before the queen. The captain Narano gave his evidence as to the killing of the soldier, but in cross-examination by Peter's advocate, admitted, for evidently he bore no malice against the prisoner, that the said soldier had roughly handled the Dona Margaret, and that the said Peter, being a stranger to the country, might very well have taken them for a troop of bandits or even Moors. Also, he added, that he could not say that the Englishman had intended to kill the soldier. Then Castell and Margaret gave their evidence, the latter with much modest sweetness. Indeed, when she explained that Peter was her affianced husband, to whom she was to have been wed on the day after she had been stolen away from England, and that she had cried out to him for help when the dead soldier caught hold of her and rent away her veil, there was a murmur of sympathy, and the king and queen began to talk with each other without paying much heed to her further words. Next they spoke to two of the judges who sat with them, after which the king held up his hand and announced that they had come to a decision on the case. It was that, under the circumstances, the Englishman was justified in cutting down the soldier, especially as there was nothing to show that he meant to kill him, or that he knew that he belonged to the Holy Hermandad. He would, therefore, be discharged on the condition that he paid a sum of money, which indeed it appeared had already been paid to the man's widow in compensation for the man's death, and a further small sum for masses to be said for the welfare of his soul. Peter gave thanks for this judgment, but while he was still speaking the king asked if any of those present wished to proceed in further suits. Instantly Betty rose and said that she did. Then, through her interpreter, she stated that she had received the royal commands to attend before their majesties, and was now prepared to answer any questions or charges that might be laid against her. "What is your name, Signora?" asked the king. "Elizabeth, Marchioness of Morella, born Elizabeth Dean, of the ancient and gentle family of Dean, a native of England," answered Betty in a clear and decided voice. The king bowed, then asked, "Does anyone dispute this title and description?" "I do," answered the Marquis of Morella, speaking for the first time. "On what grounds, Marquis?" "On every ground," he answered. "She is not the Marchioness of Morella, inasmuch as I went through the ceremony of marriage with her, believing her to be another woman. She is not of ancient and gentle family, since she was a servant in the house of the merchant Castell yonder in London." "That proves nothing, Marquis," interrupted the king. "My family may, I think, be called ancient and gentle, which you will be the last to deny, yet I have played the part of a servant on an occasion which I think the queen here will remember," an allusion at which the audience, who knew well enough to what it referred, laughed audibly, as did her majesty. Footnote 1. When travelling from Saragossa to Envoi to be married to Isabella, Ferdinand was obliged to pass himself off as a valet. Prescott says, quote, "The greatest circumspection, therefore, was necessary. The party journeyed chiefly in the night. Ferdinand assumed the disguise of a servant and, when they halted on the road, took care of the mules and served his companions at table." End quote. "The marriage and rank are matters for proof," went on the king, "if they are questioned. But is it alleged that this lady has committed any crime which prevents her from pleading?" "None," answered Betty quickly, "except that of being poor, and the crime, if it is one, as it may be, of having married that man, the Marquis of Morella," whereat the audience laughed again. "Well, madam, you do not seem to be poor now," remarked the king, looking at her gorgeous and bejewelled apparel. "And here we are more apt to think marriage a folly than a crime," a light saying at which the queen frowned a little. "But," he added quickly, "set out your case, madam, and forgive me if, until you have done so, I do not call you Marchioness." "Here is my case, sire," said Betty, producing the certificate of marriage and handing it up for inspection. The judges and their majesties inspected it, the queen remarking that a duplicate of this document had already been submitted to her and passed on to the proper authorities. "Is the priest who solemnized the marriage present?" asked the king, whereon Bernaldez, Castell's agent, rose and said that he was, though he neglected to add that his presence had been secured for no mean sum. One of the judges ordered that he should be called, and presently the foxy-faced Father Henriques, at whom the Marquis glared angrily, appeared bowing, and was sworn in the usual form, and, on being questioned, stated that he had been priest at Motril and chaplain to the Marquis of Morella, but was now a secretary of the Holy Office at Seville. In answer to further questions he said that, apparently by the bridegroom's own wish, and with his full consent, on a certain date at Granada he had married the Marquis to the lady who stood before them, and whom he knew to be named Betty Dene. Also that at her request, since she was anxious that proper record should be kept of her marriage, he had written the certificates which the court had seen, which certificates the Marquis and others had signed immediately after the ceremony in his private chapel at Granada. Subsequently he had left Granada to take up his appointment as a secretary to the Inquisition at Seville, which had been conferred on him by the ecclesiastical authorities in reward of a treatise which he had written upon heresy. That was all he knew about the affair. Now Morella's advocate rose to cross-examine, asking him who had made the arrangements for the marriage. He answered that the Marquis had never spoken to him directly on the subject. At least he had never mentioned to him the name of the lady. The Señora Inez arranged everything. Now the Queen broke in, asking where was the Señora Inez and who she was. The priest replied that the Señora Inez was a Spanish woman, one of the Marquis' household at Granada, whom he had made use of in all confidential affairs. She was young and beautiful, but he could say no more about her. As to where she was now he did not know, although they had ridden together to Seville. Perhaps the Marquis knew. Now the priest was ordered to stand down, and Betty tendered herself as a witness, and through her interpreter told the court the story of her connection with Morella. She said that she had met him in London when she was a member of the household of the Señor Castell, and that at once he began to make love to her and won her heart. Subsequently he suggested that she should elope with him to Spain, promising to marry her at once, in proof of which she produced the letter he had written, which was translated and handed up for the inspection of the court. A very awkward letter, as they evidently thought, although it was not signed with the writer's real name. Next Betty explained the trick by which she and her cousin Margaret were brought on board his ship, and that when they arrived there the Marquis refused to marry her, alleging that he was in love with her cousin and not with her, a statement which she took to be an excuse to avoid the fulfilment of his promise. She could not say why he had carried off her cousin Margaret also, but supposed that it was because, having once brought her upon the ship, he did not know how to be rid of her. Then she described the voyage to Spain, saying that during that voyage she kept the Marquis at a distance, since there was no priest to marry them. Also, she was sick and much ashamed, who had involved her cousin and mistress in this trouble. She told how the Señors Castell and Khaghbboommm had followed in another vessel and boarded the caravel in a storm, also of the shipwreck and their journey to Granada as prisoners, and of their subsequent life there. Finally she described how Inez came to her with proposals of marriage, and how she bargained that if she consented, her cousin, the Señor Castell, and the Señor Khaghbboommm should go free. They went accordingly, and the marriage took place as arranged, the Marquis first embracing her publicly in the presence of various people, namely Inez and his 2 secretaries, who, except Inez, were present and could bear witness to the truth of what she said. After the marriage and the signing of the certificates, she had accompanied him to his own apartments, which she had never entered before, and there, to her astonishment, in the morning, he announced that he must go a journey upon their Majesties' business. Before he went, however, he gave her a written authority, which she produced, to receive his rents and manage his matters in Granada during his absence, which authority she read to the gathered household before he left. She had obeyed him accordingly until she had received the royal command, receiving moneys, giving her receipt for the same, and generally occupying the unquestioned position of mistress of his house. "We can well believe it," said the king dryly. "And now, Marquis, what have you to answer to all this?" "I will answer presently," replied Morella, who trembled with rage. "First suffer that my advocate cross-examine this woman." So the advocate cross-examined, though it cannot be said that he had the better of Betty. First he questioned her as to her statement that she was of ancient and gentle family, whereon Betty overwhelmed the court with a list of her ancestors, the first of whom, a certain Sieur d'Amde, had come to England with the Norman Duke, William the Conqueror. After him, so she still swore, the said d'Amde had risen to great rank and power, and having been the favourites of the kings of England, and fought for them generation after generation. By slow degrees she came down to the Wars of the Roses, in which she said her grandfather had been attainted for his loyalty and lost his land and titles, so that her father, whose only child she was, being now the representative of the noble family d'Amde, fell in poverty and a humble place in life. However, he married a lady of even more distinguished race than his own, a direct descendant of a noble Saxon family, far more ancient in blood than the upstart Normans. At this point, while Peter and Margaret listened amazed, at a hint from the queen, the bewildered court interfered through the head alcaldes, praying her to cease from the history of her descent, which they took for granted was as noble as any in England. Next she was examined as to her relations with Morella in London, and told the tale of his wooing with so much detail and imaginative power that in the end that also was left unfinished. So it was with everything. Clever as Morella's advocate might be, sometimes in English and sometimes in the Spanish tongue, Betty overwhelmed him with words and apt answers, until, able to make nothing of her, the poor man sat down, wiping his brow and cursing her beneath his breath. Then the secretaries were sworn, and after them various members of Morella's household, who, although somewhat unwillingly, confirmed all that Betty had said to his embracing her with lifted veil and the rest. So at length Betty closed her case, reserving the right to address the court after she had heard that of the Marquis. Now the king, queen, and their assessors consulted for a little while, for evidently there was a division of opinion among them, some thinking that the case should be stopped at once and referred to another tribunal, and others that it should go on. At length the queen was heard to say that at least the Marquis of Morella should be allowed to make his statement, as he might be able to prove that all this story was a fabrication, and that he was not even at Granada at the time when the marriage was alleged to have taken place. The king and the alcaldes assenting, the Marquis was sworn and told his story, admitting that it was not one which he was proud to repeat in public. He narrated how he had first met Margaret, Betty, and Peter at a public ceremony in London, and had then and there fallen in love with Margaret, and accompanied her home to the house of her father, the merchant John Castell. Subsequently he discovered that this Castell, who had fled from Spain with his father in childhood, was that lowest of mankind, an unconverted Jew who posed as a Christian. At this statement there was a great sensation in court, and the queen's face hardened, although it is true that he had married a Christian lady, and that his daughter had been baptized and brought up as a Christian, of which faith she was a loyal member. Nor did she know, as he believed, that her father remained a Jew, since otherwise he would not have continued to seek her as his wife. Their Majesties would be aware, he went on, that owing to reasons with which they were acquainted, he had means of getting at the truth of these matters concerning the Jews of England, as to which, indeed, he had already written to them, although, owing to his shipwreck and to the pressure of his private affairs, he had not yet made his report on his embassy in person. Continuing, he said that he admitted that he had made love to the serving woman Betty in order to gain access to Margaret, whose father mistrusted him, knowing something of his mission. She was a person of no character. Here Betty rose and said in a clear voice, "I declare the Marquis of Morella to be a knave and a liar. There is more good character in my little finger than in his whole body, and," she added, "than in that of his mother before him," an allusion at which the Marquis flushed, while, satisfied for the present with this home thrust, Betty sat down. He had proposed to Margaret, but she was not willing to marry him, as he found that she was affianced to a distant cousin of hers, the Signor Peter Brome, a swashbuckler who was in trouble for the killing of a man in London, as he had killed the soldier of the Holy Hermandad in Spain. Therefore, in his despair, being deeply enamoured of her, and knowing that he could offer her great place and fortune, he conceived the idea of carrying her off, and to do so was obliged, much against his will, to abduct Betty also. So after many adventures they came to Granada, where he was able to show the Dona Margaret that the Signor Peter Brome was employing his imprisonment in making love to that member of his household, Inez, who had been spoken of, but now could not be found. Here Peter, who could bear this no longer, also rose and called him a liar to his face, saying that if he had the opportunity he would prove it on his body, but was ordered by the king to sit down and be silent. Having been convinced of her lover's unfaithfulness, the Marquis went on. The Dona Margaret had at length consented to become his wife on condition that her father, the Signor Brome, and her servant, Betty Dane, were allowed to escape from Granada. "Where," remarked the Queen, "you had no right to detain them, Marquis, except perhaps the father, John Castell," she added significantly. "Where he admitted with sorrow he had no right to detain them. Therefore," went on the Queen acutely, "there was no legal or moral consideration for this alleged promise of marriage," a point at which the lawyers nodded approvingly. The Marquis submitted that there was a consideration, that at any rate the Dona Margaret wished it. On the day arranged for the wedding the prisoners were let go, disguised as Moors, but he now knew that through the trickery of the woman Inez, whom he believed had been bribed by Castell and his fellow Jews, the Dona Margaret escaped in place of her servant, Betty, with whom he subsequently went through the form of marriage, believing her to be Margaret. As regards the embrace before the ceremony, it took place in a shadowed room, and he thought that Betty's face and hair must have been painted and dyed to resemble those of Margaret. For the rest, he was certain that the ceremonial cup of wine that he drank before he led the woman to the altar was drugged, since he only remembered the marriage itself very dimly, and after that nothing at all, until he woke upon the following morning with an aching brow to see Betty sitting by him. As for the power of administration which she produced, being perfectly mad at the time with rage and disappointment, and sure that if he stopped there any longer he should commit the crime of killing this woman, who had deceived him so cruelly, he gave it that he might escape from her. Their Majesties would notice also that it was in favour of the Marchioness of Morella. As this marriage was null and void, there was no Marchioness of Morella, Therefore the document was null and void also. That was the truth, and all he had to say. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Fair Margaret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Fair Margaret by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 22. The Doom of John Castell. His evidence finished, the Marquis of Morella sat down, whereon the King and Queen, having whispered together, the head alcalde asked Betty if she had any questions to put to him. She rose with much dignity, and through her interpreter said in a quiet voice, "Yes, a great many." Yet she would not debase herself by asking a single one until the stain which he had cast upon her was washed away, which she thought could only be done in blood. He had alleged that she was a woman of no character, and he had further alleged that their marriage was null and void. Being of the sex she was, she could not ask him to make good his assertions at the sword's point. Therefore, as she believed she had the right to do according to all the laws of honour, she asked leave to seek a champion, if an unfriended woman could find one in a strange land, to uphold her fair name against this base and cruel slander. Now, in the silence that followed her speech, Peter rose and said, "I ask the permission of your Majesties to be that champion. Your Majesties will note that according to his own story, I have suffered from this Marquis the bitterest wrong that one man can receive at the hands of another. Also, he has lied in saying that I am not true to my affianced lady, the Donna Margaret, and surely I have a right to avenge the lie upon him. Lastly, I declare that I believe the Signora Betty to be a good and upright woman, upon whom no shadow of shame has ever fallen, and, as her countryman and relative, I desire to uphold her good name before all the world. I am a foreigner here with few friends, or none, yet I cannot believe that your Majesties will withhold from me the right of battle, which all over the world in such a case one gentleman may demand of another. I challenge the Marquis of Morella to mortal combat without mercy to the fallen, and here is the proof of it." Then, stepping across the open space before the bar, he drew the leaden gauntlet off his hand and threw it straight into Morella's face, thinking that after such an insult he could not choose but fight. With an oath, Morella snatched at his sword, but before he could draw it, officers of the court threw themselves on him, and the king's stern voice was heard, commanding them to cease their brawling in the royal presences. "I ask your pardon, sire," gasped Morella, "but you have seen what this Englishman did to me, a grandee of Spain." "Yes," broke in the queen, "but we have also heard what you, a grandee of Spain, did to this gentleman of England, and the charge you brought against him, which, it seems, the Donna Margaret does not believe." "In truth, no, your Majesty," said Margaret. "Let me also be sworn, and I can explain much of what the Marquis has told you. I never wished to marry him or any man save this one," and she touched Peter on the arm, "and anything that he or I may have done we did to escape the evil net in which we were snared." "We believe it," answered the queen with a smile, then fell to consulting with the king and the alcaldes. For a long time they debated in voices so low that none could hear what they said, looking now at one and now at another of the parties to this strange suit. Also some priest was called into their council, which Margaret thought a bad omen. At length they made up their minds, and in a low, quiet voice and measured words, Her Majesty, as Queen of Castile, gave the judgment of them all. Addressing herself first to Morella, she said, "My Lord Marquis, you have brought very grave charges against the lady who claims to be your wife, and the Englishman whose affianced bride you admit you snatched away by fraud and force. This gentleman on his own behalf and on behalf of these ladies, has challenged you to a combat to the death in a fashion that none can mistake. Do you accept his challenge?" "I would accept it readily enough, your Majesty," answered Morella in sullen tones, "since heretofore none have doubted my courage. But I must remember that I am," and he paused, then added, "what your Majesties know me to be, a grandee of Spain, and something more, wherefore it is scarcely lawful for me to cross swords with a Jew's merchant clerk, for that was this man's high rank and office in England." "You could cross them with me on your ship, the San Antonio," exclaimed Peter bitterly. "Why then are you ashamed to finish what you were not ashamed to begin? Moreover, I tell you that in love or war I hold myself the equal of any woman thief and bastard in this kingdom, who am one of a name that has been honoured in my own." Now again the king and queen spoke together of this question of rank, no small one in that age and country. Then Isabella said, "It is true that a grandee of Spain cannot be asked to meet a simple foreign gentleman in single combat. Therefore, since he has thought fit to raise it, we uphold the objection of the Marquis of Morella, and declare that this challenge is not binding on his honour. Yet we note his willingness to accept the same, and are prepared to do what we can to make that matter easy, so that it may not be said that a Spaniard, who has wrought a wrong to an Englishman, has been asked openly to make the amend of arms in the presence of his sovereigns, was debarred from so doing by the accident of his rank. Señor Peter Brome, if you will receive it at our hands, as others of your nation have been proud to do, we propose, believing you to be a brave and loyal man of gentle birth, to confer upon you the knighthood of the Order of St. James, and thereby and therein the right to consort with as equal, or to fight as equal, any noble of Spain, unless he should be of the right blood royal, to which place we think the most puissant and excellent Marquis of Morella lays no claim." "I thank your Majesties," said Peter, astonished, "for the honour that you would do to me, which, had it not been for the fact that my father chose the wrong side on Bosworth Field, being of a race somewhat obstinate in the matter of loyalty, I should not have needed to accept from your Majesties. As it is, I am very grateful, since now the noble Marquis need not feel debased in settling our long quarrel as he would desire to do." "Come hither and kneel down, Señor Peter Brome," said the queen, when he finished speaking. He obeyed, and Isabella, borrowing his sword from the king, gave him the accolade by striking him thrice upon the right shoulder and saying, "Rise, Sir Peter Brome, knight of the most noble Order of Santiago, and by creation a Don of Spain." He rose, he bowed, retreating backwards as was the custom, and thereby nearly falling off the dais, which some people thought a good omen for Morella. As he went, the king said, "Our Marshal, Sir Peter, will arrange the time and manner of your combat with the Marquis, as shall be most convenient to you both. Meanwhile, we command you both that no unseemly word or deed should pass between you, who must soon meet face to face to abide the judgment of God in battle à l'outrance. Rather, since one of you must die so shortly, do we entreat you to prepare your souls to appear before his judgment seat. We have spoken." Now that the audience appeared to think that the court was ended, for many of them began to rise, but the queen held up her hand and said, "There remain other matters on which we must give judgment. The Signora here," and she pointed to Betty, "asked that her marriage should be declared valid, or so we understand, and the Marquis of Morella asked that his marriage with the said Signora should be declared void, or so we understand. Now, this is a question over which we claim no power, it having to do with a sacrament of the Church. Therefore we leave it to His Holiness the Pope in person, or by his legate, to decide according to his wisdom in such manner as may seem best to him, if the parties concerned should choose to lay their suit before him. Meanwhile we declare and decree that the Signora, born Elizabeth Dean, shall everywhere throughout her dominions, until or unless His Holiness the Pope shall decide to the contrary, be received and acknowledged as the Marchioness of Morella, and that during his lifetime her reputed husband shall make due provision for her maintenance, and that after his death, should no decision have been come to by the court of Rome upon her suit, shall inherit and enjoy the proportion of his lands and property which belongs to a wife under the laws of this realm. Now, while Betty bowed her thanks to their majesties till the jewels on her bodice rattled, and Morella scowled till his face looked as black as a thundercloud above the mountains, the audience, whispering to each other, once more rose to disperse. Again the Queen held up her hand, for the judgment was not yet finished. "We have a question to ask of gallant Sir Peter Brome and the Donna Margaret, his affianced. Is it still their desire to take each other in marriage?" Now Peter looked at Margaret, and Margaret looked at Peter, and there was that in their eyes which both of them understood, for he answered in a clear voice, "Your Majesty, that is the dearest wish of both of us." The Queen smiled a little, and then asked, "And do you, Signor John Castell, consent and allow your daughter's marriage to this knight?" "I do indeed," he answered gravely. "Had it not been for this man here," and he glanced with bitter hatred at Morella, "they would have been united long ago, and to that end," he added with meaning, "such little property as I possessed has been made over to trustees in England for their benefit and that of their children. Therefore I am henceforward dependent upon their charity." "Good," said the Queen. "Then one question remains to be put, and only one. Is it your wish, both of you, that you should be wed before the single combat between the Marquis of Morella and Sir Peter Brome? Remember, Donna Margaret, before you answer, that in this event you may soon be made a widow, and that if you postpone the ceremony, you may never be a wife." Now Margaret and Peter spoke a few words together. Then the former answered for both of them. "Should my lord fall," she said in her sweet voice that trembled as she uttered the words, "in either case my heart will be widowed and broken. Let me live out my days, therefore, bearing his name, that, knowing my deathless grief, none may thenceforth trouble me with their love, who desire to remain his bride in heaven." "Well spoken," said the Queen. "We decree that here, in our cathedral of Seville, you twain shall be wed on the same day, but before the Marquis of Morella and you, Sir Peter Brome, meet in single combat. Further, lest harm should be attempted against either of you," and she looked sideways at Morella, "you, Signora Margaret, shall be my guest until you leave my care to become a bride, and you, Sir Peter, shall return to lodge in the prison whence you came, but with liberty to see whom you will, and to go when and where you will, but under our protection, lest some attempt should be made on you." She ceased, whereon suddenly the king began speaking in his sharp, thin voice. "Having settled these matters of chivalry and marriage," he said, "there remains another, which I will not leave to the gentle lips of our sovereign lady, that has to do with something higher than either of them, namely, the eternal welfare of men's souls and of the Church of Christ on earth. It has been declared to us that the man yonder, John Castell, merchant of London, is that accursed thing, a Jew, who, for the sake of gain, has all his life feigned to be a Christian, and, as such, deceived a Christian woman into marriage; that he is, moreover, of our subjects, having been born in Spain, and therefore amenable to the civil and spiritual jurisdiction of this realm." He paused, while Margaret and Peter stared at each other affrighted. Only Castell stood silent and unmoved, though he guessed what must follow better than either of them. "We judge him not," went on the king, "who claim no authority in such high matters, but we do what we must do. We commit him to the Holy Inquisition, there to take his trial." Now Margaret cried aloud. Peter stared about him as though for help, which he knew would never come, feeling more afraid than ever he had been in all his life. For the first time that day Morella smiled. At least he would be rid of one enemy. But Castell went to Margaret and kissed her tenderly. Then he shook Peter by the hand, saying, kill that thief," and he looked at Morella, "as I know you will, and would if there were 10 as bad at his back. And be a good husband to my girl, as I know you will also, for I shall ask an account of you of these matters when we meet where there is neither Jew nor Christian, priest nor king. Now be silent, and bear what must be borne as I do, for I have a word to say before I leave you and the world. Your Majesties, I make no plea for myself, and when I am questioned before your Inquisition the task will be easy, for I desire to hide nothing, and will tell the truth, though not from fear or because I shrink from pain. Your Majesties, you have told us that these two, who at least are good enough Christians from their birth, shall be wed. I would ask you if any spiritual crime or supposed crime of mine will be allowed to work their separation, or to their detriment in any way whatsoever." "On that point," answered the Queen quickly, as though she wished to get in her words before the king or anyone else could speak, "you have our royal word, John Castell. Your case is apart from their case, and nothing of which you may be convicted shall affect them in person or," she added slowly, "in property." "A large promise," muttered the king. "It is my promise," she answered decidedly, "and it shall be kept at any cost. These two shall marry, and if Sir Peter lives through the fray, they shall depart from Spain unharmed, nor shall any fresh charge be brought against them in any court of the realm, nor shall they be persecuted or proceeded against in any other realm, or on the high seas at our instance, or that of our officers. Let my words be written down, and one copy of them signed and filed, and another copy given to the Donna Margaret." "Your Majesty," said Castell, "I thank you. And now, if I must die, I shall die happy. Yet I make bold to tell you that had you not spoken them, it was my purpose to kill myself here before your eyes, since that is a sin for which none can be asked to suffer save the sinner. Also I say that this Inquisition which you have set up shall eat out the heart of Spain and bring her greatness to the dust of death. The torture and the misery of those Jews, than whom you have no better or more faithful subjects, shall be avenged on the heads of your children's children for so long as their blood endures." He finished speaking, and, while something that sounded like a gasp of fear rose from that crowded court as the meaning of Castell's bold words came home to his auditors, the crowd behind him separated, and there appeared, walking 2 by 2, a file of masked and hooded monks, and a guard of soldiers, all of whom doubtless were in waiting. They came to John Castell, they touched him on the shoulder, they closed around him, hiding him as if it were from the world, and in the midst of them he vanished away. Peter's memories of that strange day in the Alcazar at Seville always remained somewhat dim and blurred. It was not wonderful. Within the space of a few hours he had been tried for his life and acquitted. He had seen Betty, transformed from a humble companion into a magnificent and glittering marchioness, as chrysalis is transformed into a butterfly, urge her strange suit against the husband who had tricked her and whom she had tricked, and, for the while at any rate, more than hold her own, thanks to her ready wit and native strength of character. As her champion, and that of Margaret, he had challenged Morella to a single combat, and when his defiance was refused on the ground of his lack of rank, by the fervour of the great Isabella, who wished to use him as her instrument, doubtless because of those secret ambitions of Morella's which Margaret had revealed to her, he had been suddenly advanced to the high station of a Knight of the Order of St. James of Spain, to which, although he cared little for it, otherwise he might have vainly striven to come. More, and better far, the desire of his heart would at length be attained, for now it was granted to him to meet his enemy, the man whom he hated with just cause, upon a fair field, without favour shown to one or the other, and to fight him to the death. He had been promised further that within some few days Margaret should be given to him as wife, although it well might be that she would keep that name but for a single hour, and that until they both should dwell safe from Morella's violence and treachery, also that, whatever chance, no suit should lie against them in any land for aught that they did or had done in Spain. Lastly, when all seemed safe save for that chance of war, whereof, having been bred to such things, he took but little count, when his cup, emptied at length of mire and sand, was brimming full with the good red wine of battle and love, when it was at his very lips indeed, fate had turned it to poison and to gall. Castell, his bride's father, and the man he loved, had been haled to the vaults of the Inquisition, whence he knew well he would come forth but once more, dressed in a yellow robe, relaxed to the civil arm, to perish slowly in the fires of the Quemadero, place of burning heretics. What would his contest over Morella avail if heaven should give him power to conquer? What kind of bridal would that be which was sealed and consecrated by the death of the bride's father in the torturing fires of the Inquisition? How would they ever get the smell of the smoke of that sacrifice out of their nostrils? Castell was a brave man. No torments would make him recant. It was doubtful even if he would be at the pains to deny his faith, he who had only been baptized as Christian by his father for the sake of policy, and suffered the fraud to continue for the purposes of his business, and that he might win and keep a Christian wife. No, Castell was doomed, and he could no more protect him from priest and king than a dove can protect its nest from a pair of hungry peregrines. Oh, that last scene! Never could Peter forget it while he lived. The vast fretted hall, with its painted arches and marble columns, the rays of the afternoon sun piercing the window places and streaming like blood on the black robes of the monks as, with their prey, they vanished back into the arcade where they had lurked. Margaret's wild cry and her ashen face as her father was torn away from her, and she sank fainting onto Betty's bejewelled bosom. The cruel sneer on Morella's lips, the king's hard smile, pity in the queen's eye, the excited murmurings of the crowd, the quick brief comments of the lawyers, the scratching of the clerk's quill as, careless of everything save his work, he recorded the various decrees, and above it all, as it were, upright, defiant, unmoved, Castell, surrounded by the ministers of death, vanquishing into the blackness of the arcade, vanishing into the jaws of the tomb. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Fair Margaret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Fair Margaret by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 23. Father Henriques and the Baker's Oven. Father Henriques and the Baker's Oven. A week had gone by. Margaret was in the palace, where Peter had been to see her twice, and found her broken-hearted. Even the fact that they were to be wed upon the following Saturday, the day fixed also for the combat between Peter and Morella, brought her no joy or consolation. For on the next day, the Sunday, there was to be an act of faith, an auto de fe in Seville, when wicked heretics, such as Jews, Moors, and persons who had spoken blasphemy, were to suffer for their crimes, some by fire on the Quemadero, or place of burning outside the city, some by making public confession of their grievous sin before they were carried off to perpetual and solitary imprisonment, some by being garroted before their bodies were given to the flames, and so forth. In this ceremony it was known that John Castell had been doomed to play a leading part. On her knees, with tears and beseechings, Margaret had prayed the Queen for mercy, but in this matter those tears produced no more effect upon the heart of Isabella than does water dripping on a diamond. Gentle enough in other ways, where questions of the faith were concerned, she had the craft of a fox and the cruelty of a tiger. She was even indignant with Margaret. Had not enough been done for her, she asked? Had she not even passed her royal word that no step should be taken to deprive the accused of such property as he might own in Spain if he were found guilty, and that none of those penalties which, according to law and custom, fell upon the children of such infamous persons should attach to her, Margaret? Was she not to be publicly married to her lover, and, should he survive the combat, allowed to depart with him in honour, without even being asked to see her father expiate his iniquity? Surely, as a good Christian, she should rejoice that he was given this opportunity of reconciling his soul with God, and be made an example to others of his accursed faith. Was she then also a heretic? So she stormed on, till Margaret crept from her presence, wondering whether this creed could be right, that would force the child to inform against and bring the parent to torment. Where were such things written in the sayings of the Saviour and his apostles? And if they were not written, who had invented them? "Save him! Save him!" Margaret had gasped to Peter in despair. "Save him, or I swear to you, however much I may love you, however much we may seem to be married, never shall you be a husband to me." "That seems hard," replied Peter, shaking his head mournfully, "since it was not I who gave him over to these devils, and probably the end of it would be that I should share his fate. Still, I'll do what a man can." "No, no," she cried in despair, "do nothing that will bring you into danger." But he had gone without waiting for her answer. It was night, and Peter sat in a secret room in a certain baker's shop in Seville. There were present there besides himself the Fray Henriques, now a secretary to the Holy Inquisition, but disguised as a layman, the woman Inez, the agent Bernaldez, and the old Jew, Israel of Granada. "I have brought him here, never mind how," Inez was saying, pointing to Henriques. "A frisky and disagreeable business enough. And now, what is the use of it?" "No use at all," answered the Fray coolly, "except to me, who pocket my 10 gold pieces." "1,000 doubloons if our friend escapes safe and sound," put in the Jew Israel. "God in heaven, think of it! 1,000 doubloons!" The secretary's eyes gleamed hungrily. "I could do with them well enough," he answered, "and hell could spare one filthy Jew for 10 years or so, but I see no way. What I do see is that probably all of you will join him. It is a great crime to try to tamper with a servant of the Holy Office." Bernaldez turned white, and the old Jew bit his nails, but Inez tapped the priest upon the shoulder. "Are you thinking of betraying us?" she asked in her gentle voice. "Look here, friend, I have some knowledge of poisons, and I swear to you that if you attempt it, you shall die within a week, tied in a double knot, and never know whence the dose came. Or I can bewitch you, I, who have not lived a dozen years among the Moors for nothing, so that your head swells and your body wastes, and you utter blasphemies, not knowing what you say, until, for very shame's sake, they toast you among the faggots also." "Bewitch me!" answered Henriques with a shiver. "You have already done that, or I should not be here." "Then, if you do not wish to be in another place before your time," went on Inez, still tapping his shoulder gently, think, and find a way, worthy servant of the Holy Office." 1,000 doubloons, 1,000 gold doubloons, croaked old Israel. "Or if you fail, sooner or later, this month or next, this year or next, death as slow and cruel as we can make it. There are 2 Inquisitions in Spain, Holy Father, but one of them does its business in the dark, and your name is on its ledger." Now Henriques was very frightened, as well he might be with all those eyes glaring at him. "You need fear nothing," he said. "I know the devilish power of your league too well, and that, if I kill you or 100 others I have never seen or heard, would dog me to my death, who have taken your accursed money." "I am glad that you understand at last, dear friend," said the soft, mocking voice of Inez, who stood behind the monk like an evil genius, and again tapped him affectionately on the shoulder, this time with the bare blade of a poniard. "Now be quick with that plan of yours. It grows late, and all holy people should be abed." "I have none. I defy you," he answered furiously. "Very well, friend, very well. Then I will say good night, or rather farewell, since I am not likely to meet you again in this world." "Where are you going?" he asked anxiously. "Oh, to the palace to meet the Marquis of Morella and a friend of his, a relation indeed. Look you here, I have had an offer of pardon for my part in that marriage if I can prove that a certain base priest knew that he was perpetrating a fraud. Well, I can prove it. You may remember that you wrote me a note, and if I do, what happens to such a priest who chances to have incurred the hatred of the Grande of Spain and of his noble relation?" "I am an officer of the Holy Inquisition. No one dare touch me," he gasped. "Oh, I think that there are some who would take the risk. For instance, the king." Fray Henriques sat back in his chair. Now he understood whom Inez meant by the noble relative of Morella, understood also that he had been trapped. "On Sunday morning," he began in a hollow whisper, "the procession will be formed and wind through the streets of the city to the theatre, where the sermon will be preached before those relaxed proceed to the Quemadero. About 8 o'clock it turns on the quay for a little way only, and here will be but few spectators, since the view of the pageant is bad, nor is the road guarded there. Now, if a dozen determined men were waiting, disguised as peasants with a boat at hand, perhaps they might—" And he paused. Then Peter, who had been watching and listening to all this play, spoke for the first time, asking, "In such an event, reverend sir, how would those determined men know which was the victim that they sought?" "The heretic John Castell," he answered, "will be seated on an ass, clad in a zamara of sheepskin, painted with fiends and a likeness of his own head burning. Very well done, for I, who can draw, had a hand in it. Also, he alone will have a rope round his neck, by which he may be known." "Why will he be seated on an ass?" asked Peter savagely. "Because you have tortured him so that he cannot walk?" "Not so, not so," said the Dominican, shrinking from those fierce eyes. "He has never been questioned at all, not a single turn to the mancuerda, I swear to you, Sir Knight. What was the use, since he openly avows himself an accursed Jew?" "Be more gentle in your talk, friend," broke in Inez, with her familiar tap upon the shoulder. "There are those here who do not think so ill of Jews as you do in your holy house, but who understand how to apply the mancuerda, and can make a very serviceable rack out of a plank and a pulley or two such as lie in the next room. Cultivate courtesy, most learned priest, lest before you leave this place you should add a cubit to your stature." "Go on," growled Peter. "Moreover," added Fray Henriques shakily, "orders came that it was not to be done. The Inquisitors thought otherwise, as they believe, doubtless in error, that he might have accomplices whose names he would give up. But the order said that, as he had lived so long in England, and only recently travelled to Spain, he could have none. Therefore he is sound as a bell. Never before, I am told, has an impenitent Jew gone to the stake in such good case, however worthy and worshipful he might be." "So much the better for you, if you do not lie," answered Peter. "Continue." "There is nothing more to say, except that I shall be walking next to him with the two guards, and, of course, if he were snatched away from us, there were no boats handy in which to pursue. We could not help it, could we? Indeed, we priests, who are men of peace, might even fly at the sight of cruel violence." "I should have advised you to fly fast and far," said Peter. "But, Inez, what hold have you on this friend of yours? He will trick everybody." "A thousand doubloons," muttered old Israel like a sleepy parrot. "He may think to screw more than that out of the carcasses of some of us, old man. Come, Inez, you're quick at this game. How can we best hold him to his word?" "Dead, I think," broke in Bernaldez, who knew his danger as the partner and relative of Castell, and the nominal owner of the ship Margaret, in which it was purposed that he should escape. "We know all that he can tell, and if we let him go he will betray us sooner or later. Kill him out of the way, I say, and burn his body in the oven." Now Henriques fell upon his knees, and with groans and tears began to implore mercy. "Why do you complain so?" asked Inez, watching him with reflective eyes. "The end would be so much gentler than that which you righteous folk mete out to so many more honest men, yes, and women too. For my part, I think that the Señor Bernaldez gives good counsel. Better that you should die, who are but one, than all of us and others, for you will understand that we cannot trust you. Has anyone got a rope?" Now Henriques grovelled on the ground before her, kissing the hem of her robe, and praying her in the name of all the saints to show pity on one who had been betrayed into this danger by love of her. "Of money, you mean told," she answered, kicking him with her slippered foot. "I had to listen to your talk of love while we journeyed together and before, but here I need not, and if you speak of it again, you shall go living into the baker's oven. Oh, you have forgotten it, but I have a long score to settle with you. You were a familiar of the Holy Office here at Seville, were you not, before Morella promoted you to Motril for your zeal, and made you one of his chaplains? Well, I had a sister." And she knelt down and whispered a name into his ear. He uttered a sound. It was more of a scream than a gasp. "I had nothing to do with her death," he protested. "She was brought within the walls of the Holy House by someone who had a grudge against her and bore false witness." "Yes, I know. It was you who had the grudge, you snake-souled rogue, and it was you who gave the false witness. It was you also who but the other day volunteered the corroborative evidence that was necessary against Castell, saying that he had passed the rood at your house in Motril without doing it reverence, and other things. It was you, too, who urged your superiors to put him to the question, because you said he was rich and had rich friends, and much money could be wrung out of him and them, whereof you were going to get your share. Oh, yes, my information is good, is it not? Even what passes in the dungeons of the Holy House comes to the ears of the woman Inez. Well, do you still think the baker's oven too hot for you?" By this time Henriques was speechless with terror. There he knelt upon the floor, glaring at this soft-voiced, remorseless woman who had made a tool and a fool of him, who had beguiled him there that night, and who hated him so bitterly and with so just a cause. Peter was speaking now. "It would be better not to stain our hands with the creature's blood," he said. "Caged rats give little sport, and he might be tracked. For my part, I would leave his judgment to God. Have you no other way, Inez?" She thought a while, then prodded the Fray Henriques with her foot, saying, "Get up, sainted secretary to the Holy Office, and do a little writing, which will be easy to you. See, here are pens and paper. Now, I'll dictate. Most adorable Inez, your dear message has reached me safe here in this accursed holy house, where we lighten heretics of their sins to the benefit of their souls, and of their goods to the benefit of our own bodies." "I cannot write it," groaned Henriques. "It is rank heresy." "No, only the truth," answered Inez. "Heresy and the truth, well, they are often the same thing. They would burn me for it." "That is just what many heretics have urged. They have died gloriously for what they hold to be the truth. Why should not you? Listen," she went on more sternly. "Will you take your chance of burning on the Quemadero, which you will not do unless you betray us, or will you certainly burn more privately but better in a baker's oven, and within half an hour? Ah, I thought you would not hesitate. Continue your letter, most learned scribe. Are those words down? Yes. Now add these. I note all you tell me about the trial at the Alcazar before their Majesties. I believe that the Englishwoman will win her cause. That was a very pretty trick that I played on the most noble Marquis at Granada. Nothing neater was ever done, even in this place. Well, I owed him a long score, and I have paid him off in full. I should like to have seen his exalted countenance when he surveyed the features of his bride, the waiting woman, and knew that the mistress was safe away with another man. The nephew of the king, who would like himself to be king some day, married to an English waiting woman. Good, very good, dear Inez. Now, as regards the Duke John Castell, I think that the matter may possibly be managed, provided that the money is all right, for, as you know, I do not work for nothing. Thus, and Inez dictated with admirable lucidity those suggestions as to the rescue of Castell, with which the reader is already acquainted, ending the letter as follows. These inquisitors here are cruel beasts, though fonder of money than of blood, for all their talk about zeal for the faith is so much wind before the mountains. They care as much for the faith as the mountain cares for the wind, or, let us say, as I do. They wanted to torture the poor fellow, thinking that he would rain maravedis, but I gave a hint in the right quarter, and their fun was stopped. Carissima, I must stop also. It is my hour for duty, but I hope to meet you as arranged, and we will have a merry evening. Love to the newly married Marquis if you meet him, and to yourself, you know how much. Your Henriques. Postscriptum. This position will scarcely be as remunerative as I hoped, so I am glad to be able to earn a little outside, enough to buy you a present that will make your pretty eyes shine. There, said Inez mildly, I think that covers everything, and would burn you 3 or 4 times over. Let me read it to see that it is plainly written and properly signed, for in such matters a good deal turns on handwriting. Yes, that will do. Now you understand, don't you, if anything goes wrong about the matter we have been talking of, that is, if the worthy John Castell is not rescued, or a smell of our little plot should get into the wind, this letter goes at once to the right quarter, and a certain secretary will wish that he had never been born. Man, she added in a hissing whisper, you shall die by inches, as my sister did. 1,000 doubloons if the thing succeeds, and you live to claim them, croaked old Israel. I do not go back upon my word. Death and shame and torture, or 1,000 doubloons. Now he knows our terms. Blindfold him again. Signor Bernaldez, and away with him, for he poisons the air. But first you, Inez, be gone, and lodge that letter where you know. That same night, 2 cloaked figures, Peter and Bernaldez, were rowed in a little boat out to where the Margaret lay in the river, and, making her fast, slipped up the ship's side into the cabin. Here the stout English captain, Smith, was waiting for them, and so glad was the honest fellow to see Peter, that he cast his arms about him and hugged him, for they had not met since the desperate adventure of the boarding of the San Antonio. "Is your ship fit for sea, Captain?" asked Peter. "She will never be fitter," he answered. "Where shall I get sailing orders?" "When the owner comes aboard," answered Peter. "Then we shall stop here until we rot. They have trapped him in their inquisition. What is in your mind, Peter Brome? What is in your mind? Is there a chance?" "Aye, Captain, I think so, if you have a dozen fellows of the right English stuff between decks." "We've got that number, and 1 or 2 more, but what's the plan?" Peter told him. "Not so bad," said Smith, slapping his heavy hand upon his knee, "but risky, very risky. That Inez must be a good girl. I should like to marry her, notwithstanding her bygones." Peter laughed, thinking what an odd couple they would make. "Hear the rest, then talk," he said. "See now, on Saturday next, Mistress Margaret and I are to be married in the cathedral. Then, towards sunset, the Marquis of Morella and I run our course in that great bull ring yonder, and you and half a dozen of your men will be present. Now, I may conquer or I may fail." "Never, never," said the captain. "I wouldn't give a pair of old boots for that fine Spaniard's chance when you get at him. Why, you will crimp him like a codfish." "God knows," answered Peter. "If I win, my wife and I make our adieu to their majesties, and ride away to the quay, where the boat will be waiting, and you will row us on board the Margaret. If I fail, you will take up my body, and, accompanied by my widow, bring it in the same fashion on board the Margaret, for I shall give it out that, in this case, I wish to be embalmed in wine and taken back to England for burial. In either event, you will drop your ship a little way down the river around the bend, so that folk may think that you have sailed. In the darkness you must work her back with the tide, and lay her behind those old hulks, and if any ask you why, say that 3 of your men have not yet come aboard, and that you've dropped back for them, and whatever else you like. Then, in case I should not be alive to guide you, you and 10 or 12 of the best sailors will land at the spot that this gentleman will show you tomorrow, wearing Spanish clothes so as not to attract attention, but being well armed underneath them, like idlers from some ship who had come ashore to see the show. I've told you how you may know Master Castell. When you see him, make a rush for him, cut down any that try to stop you, tumble him into the boat, and row for your lives to the ship, which will slip her moorings and get up her canvas as soon as she sees you coming, and begin to drop down the river with the tide and wind, if there is one. That's the plot, but God alone knows the end of it, which depends upon him and the sailors. Will you play this game for the love of a good man and the rest of us? If you succeed, you shall be rich for your life, all of you." "Aye," answered the captain, "and there's my hand on it. So sure as my name is Smith, we will hook him out of that hell, if men can do it, and not for the money either. Why, Peter, we have sat idle so long, waiting for you and our lady, that we shall be glad of the fun. At any rate, there will be some dead Spaniards before they've done with us, and, if we are worsted, I'll leave the mate and enough hands upon the ship to bring us safe to Tilbury. But we won't be. By this day week we'll all be rolling homewards across the bay, with never a Spaniard within 300 miles, you and your lady and Master Castell too. I know it. I tell you, lad, I know it." "How do you know it?" asked Peter curiously. "Because I dreamed it last night. I saw you and Mistress Margaret sitting sweet as sugar with your arms around each other's middles, while I talked to the master, and the sun went down with the wind blowing stiff from the south-southwest, and a gale threatening. I tell you that I dreamed it, I who am not given to dreams." End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Fair Margaret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fair Margaret by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 24. The Falcon Stoops. It was the marriage day of Margaret and Peter, clad in white armor that had been sent to him as a present from the Queen, a sign and a token of her good wishes for his success in his combat with Morella, wearing the insignia of a Knight of St. James hanging by a ribbon from his neck, his shield emblazoned with his coat of the stooping falcon, which appeared also upon the white cloak that hung from his shoulders, behind him a squire of high degree, who carried his plumed casque and lance, and accompanied by an escort of the royal guards. Peter rode from his quarters in the prison to the palace gates, and waited there as he had been bidden. Presently they opened, and through them, seated on a palfrey, appeared Margaret, wonderfully attired in white and silver, but with her veil lifted so that her face could be seen. She was companioned by a troop of maidens mounted, all of them, on white horses, and at her side, almost outshining her in glory of apparel, and attended by all her household, rode Betty, Marchioness of Morella, at any rate for that present time. Although she could never be less than beautiful, it was a worn and pale Margaret who bowed her greetings to the bridegroom without those palace gates. What wonder, since she knew that within a few hours his life must be set upon the hazard of a desperate fray? What wonder, since she knew that tomorrow her father was doomed to be burnt living upon the quemadero? They met, they greeted, then, with silver trumpets blowing before them, the glittering procession wound its way through the narrow streets of Seville. But few words passed between them, whose hearts were too full for words, who had said all they had to say, and now abided the issue of events. Betty, however, whom many of the populace took for the bride, because her air was so much the happier of the two, would not be silent. Indeed, she chid Margaret for her lack of gaiety upon such an occasion. "Oh, Betty, Betty," answered Margaret, "how can I be gay, upon whose heart lies the burden of tomorrow?" "A pest upon the burden of tomorrow," exclaimed Betty. "The burden of today is enough for me, and that is not so bad to bear. Never shall we have another such ride as this, with all the world staring at us, and every woman in Seville envying us and our good looks and the favour of the Queen." "I think it is you they stare at and envy," said Margaret, glancing at the splendid woman at her side, whose beauty she knew well overshadowed her own rarer loveliness. At any rate, in a street pageant, as in the sunshine, the rose overshadows the lily. "Well," answered Betty, "if so, it is because I put the better face on things, and smile even if my heart bleeds. At least, your lot is more hopeful than mine. If your husband has to fight to the death presently, so has mine, and between ourselves I favour Peter's chances. He is a very stubborn fighter, Peter, and wonderfully strong, too stubborn and strong for any Spaniard." "Well, that is as it should be," said Margaret, smiling faintly, "seeing that Peter is your champion, and if he loses, you are stamped as a serving girl and a woman of no character." "A serving girl I was, or something not far different," replied Betty in a reflective voice. "And my character is a matter between me and heaven, though, after all, it might scrape through where others fail to pass. So these things do not trouble me overmuch. What troubles me is that if my champion wins, he kills my husband." "You don't want him to be killed, then?" asked Margaret, glancing at her. "No, I think not," answered Betty with a little shake in her voice, and turning her head aside for a moment. "I know he is a scoundrel, but, you see, I always liked this scoundrel, just as you always hated him, so I cannot help wishing that he was going to meet someone who hits a little less hard than Peter. Also, if he dies, without doubt his heirs will raise suits against me." "At any rate, your father is not going to be burnt tomorrow," said Margaret to change the subject, which, to tell the truth, was an awkward one. "No, cousin, if my father had his deserts, according to all accounts, although the lineage that I gave of him is true enough, doubtless he was burnt long ago and still goes on burning, in purgatory I mean, though God knows I would never bring a faggot to his fire. But Master Castell will not be burnt, so why fret about it?" "What makes you say that?" asked Margaret, who had not confided the details of a certain plot to Betty. "I don't know, but I am sure that Peter will get him out somehow. He is a very good stick to lean on, Peter, although he seems so hard and stupid and silent, which, after all, is the nature of sticks. But look, there is the cathedral. Is it not a fine place? And a great crowd of people waiting round the gate. Now smile, cousin, bow and smile as I do." They rode up to the great doors, where Peter, springing to the ground, assisted his bride from her palfrey. Then the procession formed, and they entered the wonderful place, preceded by vergers with staves and by acolytes. Margaret had never visited it before, and never saw it again, but all her life the memory of it remained clear and vivid in her mind. The cold chill of the air within, the semi-darkness after the glare of the sunshine, the 7 great naves or aisles stretching endlessly to right and left, the dim and towering roof, the pillars that sprang to it everywhere like huge forest trees aspiring to the skies, the solemn shadows pierced by lines of light from the high-cut windows, the golden glory of the altars, the sounds of chanting, the sepulchres of the dead, a sense of all these things rushed in upon her, overpowering her and stamping the picture of them forever on her memory. Slowly they passed onward to the choir, and round it to the steps of the great altar of the chief chapel. Here, between the choir and the chapel, was gathered the congregation, no small one, and here, side by side to the right and without the rails, in chairs of state, sat their Majesties of Spain, who had chosen to grace this ceremony with their presence. More, as the bride came, the Queen Isabella, as a special act of grace, rose from her seat and, bending forward, kissed her on the cheek while the choir sang and the noble music rolled. It was a splendid spectacle, this marriage of hers, celebrated in perhaps the most glorious fane in Europe. But even as Margaret noted it and watched the bishops and priests decked with glittering embroideries, summoned there to do her honor, as they moved to and fro in the mysterious ceremonial of the Mass, she bethought her of other rites equally glorious that would take place on the morrow in the greatest square of Seville, where these same dignitaries would condemn fellow human beings, perhaps among them her own father, to be married to the cruel flame. Side by side they knelt before the wondrous altar, while the incense clouds from the censers floated up one by one till they were lost in the gloom above, as the smoke of tomorrow's sacrifice would lose itself in the heavens. She and her husband, one at last, one after so many perils, perhaps to be lost again for ever before night fell upon the world. The priests chanted, the gorgeous bishop bowed over them and muttered the marriage service of their faith. The ring was set upon her hand, the troths were plighted, the benediction spoken, and they were man and wife till death should them part, that death which stood so near to them in this hour of life fulfilled. Then they two, who already that morning had made confession of their sins, kneeling alone before the altar, ate of the holy bread, sealing a mystery with a mystery. All was done and over, and rising, they turned and stayed a moment, hand in hand, while the sweet-voiced choir sang some wondrous chant. Margaret's eyes wandered over the congregation, till presently they lighted upon the dark face of Morella, who stood apart a little way, surrounded by his squires and gentlemen, and watched her. More, he came to her, and bowing low, whispered to her, "We are players in a strange game, my Lady Margaret, and what will be its end, I wonder? Shall I be dead tonight, or you a widow? Ay, and where was its beginning? Not here, I think. And where, oh where shall this seed we sow bear fruit? Well, think as kindly of me as you can, since I loved you who loved me not." And again bowing first to her, then to Peter, he passed on, taking no note of Betty, who stood near, considering him with her large eyes, as though she also wondered what would be the end of all this play. Surrounded by their courtiers, the king and queen left the cathedral, and after them came the bridegroom and the bride. They mounted their horses, and in the glory of the southern sunlight rode through the cheering crowd back to the palace and to the marriage feast, where their table was set but just below that of their Majesties. It was long and magnificent, but little could they eat, and, save to pledge each other in the ceremonial cup, no wine passed their lips. At length some trumpets blew, and their Majesties rose, the king saying in his thin clear voice that he would not bid his guests farewell, since very shortly they would all meet again in another place, where the gallant bridegroom, a gentleman of England, would champion the cause of his relative and countrywoman against one of the first grandees of Spain whom she alleged had done her wrong. That fray, alas, would be no pleasure joust, but to the death, for the feud between these knights was deep and bitter, and such were the conditions of their combat. He could not wish success to the one or to the other, but of this he was sure, that in all Seville there was no heart that would not give equal honour to the conqueror and the conquered, sure also that both would bear themselves as became brave knights of Spain and England. Then the trumpets blew again, and the squires and gentlemen who were chosen to attend him came bowing to Peter, saying that it was time for him to arm. Bride and bridegroom rose, and, while all the spectators fell back out of hearing, but watching them with curious eyes, spoke some few words together. "We part," said Peter, "and I know not what to say." "Say nothing, husband," she answered him, "lest your words should weaken me. Go now, and bear you bravely, as you will for your own honour and that of England, and for mine. Dead or living, you are my darling, and, dead or living, we shall meet once more and be at rest for aye. My prayers be with you, Sir Peter, my prayers and my eternal love, and may they bring strength to your arm and comfort to your heart." Then she, who would not embrace him before all those folk, curtsied till her knee almost touched the ground, while low he bent before her, a strange and stately parting, or so thought that company, and taking the hand of Betty, Margaret left him. 2 hours had gone by, the Plaza de Toros, for the great square where tournaments were wont to be held was in the hands of those who prepared it for the auto da fe of the morrow, was crowded as it had seldom been before. This place was a huge amphitheatre, perchance the Romans built it, where all sorts of games were celebrated, among them the baiting of bulls as it was practised in those days, and other semi-savage sports. 12,000 people could sit upon the benches that rose tier upon tier around the vast theatre, and scarce a seat was empty. The arena itself, that was long enough for horses starting at either end of it to come to their full speed, was strewn with white sand, as it may have been in the days when gladiators fought there. Over the main entrance, and opposite to the centre of the ring, were placed the king and queen with their lords and ladies, and between them, but a little behind, her face hid by her bridal veil, sat Margaret, upright and silent as a statue. Exactly in front of them, on the further side of the ring in a pavilion, and attended by her household, appeared Betty, glittering with gold and jewels, since she was the lady in whose cause, at least in name, this combat was to be fought à l'outrance. Quite unmoved she sat, and her presence seemed to draw every eye in that vast assembly which talked of her while it waited, with a sound like the sound of the sea as it murmurs on a beach at night. Now the trumpets blew and silence fell, and then, preceded by heralds in golden tabards, Carlos, Marquis of Morella, followed by his squires, rode into the ring through the great entrance. He bestrode a splendid black horse, and was arrayed in coal-black armour, while from his casque rose black ostrich plumes. On his shield, however, painted in scarlet, appeared the eagle crowned with the coronet of his rank, and beneath the proud motto, "What I seize I tear." A splendid figure, he pressed his horse into the centre of the arena, then causing it to wheel round, pawing the air with its forelegs, saluted their majesties by raising his long steel-tipped lance, while the multitude greeted him with a shout. This done, he and his company rode away to their station at the north end of the ring. Again the trumpet sounded, and a herald appeared, while after him, mounted on a white horse, and clad in his white armour that glistened in the sun, with white plumes rising from his casque, and on his shield the stooping falcon blazoned in gold with the motto of "For Love and Honour." Beneath it appeared the tall, grim shape of Sir Peter Brome. He too rode out into the centre of the arena, and turning his horse quite soberly, as though it were on a road, lifted his lance in salute. Now there was no cheering, for this knight was a foreigner, yet soldiers who were there said to each other that he looked like one who would not easily be overthrown. A third time the trumpet sounded, and the two champions, advancing from their respective stations, drew rein side by side in front of their majesties, where the conditions of the combat were read aloud to them by the chief herald. They were short: that the fray should be to the death unless the king and queen willed otherwise and the victor consented; that it should be on horse or on foot, with lance or sword or dagger, but that no broken weapon might be replaced, and no horse or armor changed; that the victor should be escorted from the place of combat with all honor, and allowed to depart whither he would, in the kingdom or out of it, and no suit or blood feud raised against him; and that the body of the fallen be handed over to his friends for burial, also with all honor; that the issue of this fray should in no way affect any cause pleaded in courts ecclesiastical or civil by the lady who asserted herself to be the Marchioness of Morella, or by the most noble Marquis of Morella, whom she claimed as her husband. These conditions having been read, the champions were asked if they assented to them, whereupon each of them answered "Aye" in a clear voice. Then the herald, speaking on behalf of Sir Peter Brome, by creation a knight of St. Iago and a Don of Spain, solemnly challenged the noble Marquis of Morella to single combat to the death, in that he, the said Marquis, had aspersed the name of his relative, the English lady Elizabeth Dean, who claimed to be his wife, duly united to him in holy wedlock, and for sundry other causes and injuries worked towards him, the said Sir Peter Brome and his wife, Dame Margaret Brome, and in token thereof, threw down a gauntlet, which gauntlet the Marquis of Morella lifted upon the point of his lance and cast over his shoulder, thus accepting the challenge. Now the combatants dropped their visors, which heretofore had been raised, and their squires, coming forward, examined the fastenings of their armor, their weapons, and the girths and bridles of their horses. These being pronounced sound and good, pursuivants took the steeds by the bridles and led them to the far ends of the lists. At a signal from the king a single clarion blew, whereon the pursuivants loosed their hold of the bridles and sprang back. Another clarion blew, and the knights gathered up their reins, settled their shields, and set their lances in rest, bending forward over their horses' necks. An intense silence fell upon all the watching multitude as that of night upon the sea, and in the midst of it the third clarion blew. To Margaret it sounded like the trumpet of doom. From 12,000 throats one great sigh went up, like the sigh of wind upon the sea, and ere it died away, from either end of the arena, like arrows from the bow, like levens from a cloud, the champions started forth, their stallions gathering speed at every stride. Look, they met. Fair on each shield struck a lance, and backward reeled their holders. The keen points glanced aside or up, and the knights, recovering themselves, rushed past each other, shaken but unhurt. At the ends of the lists the squires caught the horses by the bridles and turned them. The first course was run. Again the clarions blew, and again they started forward, and presently again they met in mid-career. As before, the lances struck upon the shields, but so fearful was the impact that Peter's shivered, while that of Morella, sliding from the topmost rim of his foe's buckler, got hold of his visor bars. Back went Peter beneath the blow, back and still back, till almost he lay upon his horse's crupper. Then, When it seemed that he must fall, the lacings of his helm burst. It was torn from his head, and Morella passed on bearing it transfixed upon his spear-point. "The falcon falls!" screamed the spectators. "He is unhorsed!" But Peter was not unhorsed. Freed from that awful pressure, he let drop the shattered shaft, and, grasping at his saddle-strap, dragged himself back into the cell. Morella tried to stay his charger, that he might come about and fall upon the Englishman before he could recover himself, but the brute was heady, and would not be turned till he saw the wall of faces in front of him. Now they were round, both of them, but Peter had no spear and no helm, while the lance of Morella was cumbered with his adversary's casque that he strove to shake free from it, but in vain. "Draw your sword!" shouted voices to Peter, the English voices of Smith and his sailors, and he put his hand down to do so, then bethought him of some other counsel, for he let it lie within its scabbard, and spurring the white horse, came at Morella like a storm. "The falcon will be spiked!" they screamed. "The eagle wins! The eagle wins!" And indeed it seemed that it must be so. Straight at Peter's undefended face drove Morella's lance, but lo, as it came, he let fall his reins, and with his shield he struck at the white plumes about its point, the plumes torn from his own head. He had judged well, for up flew those plumes, a little, a very little, yet far enough to give him space, crouching on his saddle-bow, to pass beneath the deadly spear. Then, as they swept past each other, out shot that long right arm of his, and gripping Morella like a hook of steel, tore him from his saddle, so that the black horse rushed forward riderless, and the white sped on bearing a double burden. Grasping desperately, Morella threw his arms about his neck, and intertwined, black armor mixed with white, they swayed to and fro, while the frightened horse beneath rushed this way and that, till swerving suddenly, together they fell upon the sand, and for a moment lay there stunned. "Who conquers?" gasped the crowd, while the others answered, "Both are sped," and leaning forward in her chair, Margaret tore off her veil and watched with a face like the face of death. See, as they had fallen together, so together they stirred and rose unharmed. Now they sprang back, outflashed the long swords, and while the squires caught the horses, and, running in, seized their broken spears, they faced each other. Having no helm, Peter held his buckler above his head to shield it, and, ever calm, awaited the onslaught. At him came Morella, and with a light grating sound his sword fell upon the steel. Before he could recover himself, Peter struck back, but Morella bent his knees, and the stroke only shore the black plumes from his casque. Quick as light he drove at Peter's face with his point, but the Englishman leapt to one side, and the thrust went past him. Again Morella came at him, and struck so mighty a blow that, although Peter caught it on his buckler, it sliced through the edge of it, and fell upon his unprotected neck and shoulder, wounding him, for now red blood showed on the white armor, and Peter reeled back beneath the stroke. "The eagle wins! The eagle wins! Spain and the eagle!" shouted 10,000 throats. In the momentary silence that followed, a single voice, a clear woman's voice, which even then Margaret knew for that of Inez, cried from among the crowd, "Nay, the Falcon Stoops!" Before the sound of her words died away, maddened, it would seem, by the pain of his wound or the fear of defeat, Peter shouted out his war cry of "Khaghbboommm! Khaghbboommm!" and, gathering himself together, sprang straight at Morella as springs a starving wolf. The blue steel flickered in the sunlight, then down it fell, and lo, half the Spaniard's helm lay on the sand, while it was Morella's turn to reel backward, and more as he did so. he let fall his shield. "A stroke! A good stroke!" roared the crowd. "The falcon! The falcon!" Peter saw that fallen shield, and whether for chivalry's sake, as thought the cheering multitude, or to free his left arm, he cast away his own, and grasping the sword with both hands, rushed on the Spaniard. From that moment, helmless though he was, the issue lay in doubt no longer. Betty had spoken of Peter as a stubborn swordsman and a hard hitter, and both of these he now showed himself to be. As fresh to all appearance as when he ran the first course, he rained blow after blow upon the hapless Spaniard, till the sound of his sword smiting on the good Toledo steel was like the sound of a hammer falling continually on a smith's red iron. They were fearful blows, yet still the tough steel held, and still Morella, doing what he might, staggered back beneath them, till at length he came in front of the tribune, in which sat their Majesties and Margaret. Out of the corner of his eye Peter saw the place, and determined in his stout heart that then and there he would end the thing. Parrying a cut which the desperate Spaniard made at his head, he thrust at him so heavily that his blade bent like a bow, and although he could not pierce the black mail, almost lifted Morella from his feet. Then, as he reeled backwards, Peter whirled his sword on high and, shouting "Margaret!" struck downwards with all his strength. It fell as lightning falls, swift, keen, dazzling the eyes of all who watched. Morella raised his arm to break the blow. In vain. The weapon that he held was shattered, the casque beneath was cloven, and throwing his arms wide, he fell heavily to the ground and lay there moving feebly. For an instant there was silence, and in it a shrill woman's voice that cried, "The falcon has stooped! The English hawk has stooped!" Then there arose a tumult of shouting. "He is dead! Nay, he stirs! Kill him! Spare him, he fought well!" Peter leaned upon his sword, looking at the fallen foe. Then he glanced upwards at their Majesties, but these sat silent, making no sign. Only he saw Margaret try to rise from her seat and speak, to be pulled back to it again by the hands of women. A deep hush fell upon the watching thousands who waited for the end. Peter looked at Morella. Alas, he still lived. His sword and the stout helmet had broken the weight of that stroke, mighty though it had been. The man was but wounded in 3 places and stunned. "What must I do?" asked Peter in a hollow voice to the royal pair above him. Now the king, who seemed moved, was about to speak, but the queen bent forward and whispered something to him, and he remained silent. They both were silent. All the intent multitude was silent. Knowing what this dreadful silence meant, Peter cast down his sword and drew his dagger, wherewith to cut the lashings of Morella's gorget and give the coup de grace. Just then it was for the first time he heard a sound, far away upon the other side of the arena, and, looking thither, saw the strangest sight that ever his eyes beheld. Over the railing of the pavilion opposite to him a woman climbed nimbly as a cat, and from it, like a cat, dropped to the ground full 10 feet below, then, gathering up her dress about her knees, ran swiftly towards him. It was Betty, Betty without a doubt, Betty in her gorgeous garb, with pearls and braided hair flying loose behind her. He stared amazed. All stared amazed, and in half a minute she was on them, and standing over the fallen Morella, gasped out, "Let him be! I bid you let him be!" Peter knew not what to do or say, so advanced to speak with her, whereon with a swoop like that of a swallow she pounced upon his sword that lay in the sand, and leaping back to Morella, shook it on high, shouting, "You will have to fight me first, Peter." Indeed, she did more, striking at him so shrewdly with his own sword that he was forced to spring sideways to avoid the stroke. Now a great roar of laughter went up to heaven. Yes, even Peter laughed, for no such thing as this had ever before been seen in Spain. It died away, and again Betty, who had no low voice, shouted in her villainous Spanish, "He shall kill me before he kills my husband. Give me my husband." "Take him, for my part," answered Peter, whereon, letting fall the sword, Betty, filled with the strength of despair, lifted the senseless Spaniard in her strong white arms as though he were a child, and his bleeding head, lying on her shoulder, strove to carry him away, but could not. Then, while all that audience cheered frantically, Peter, with a gesture of despair, threw down his dagger and once more appealed to their majesties. The king rose and held up his hand, at the same time motioning to Morella's squires to take him from the woman, which, seeing their cognizance, Betty allowed them to do. "Marchioness of Morella," said the king, for the first time giving her that title, "your honour is cleared, your champion has conquered, and this fierce fray was to the death. What have you to say?" "Nothing," answered Betty, "except that I love the man, though he has treated me and others ill, and, as I knew he would if he crossed swords with Peter, has got his deserts for his deeds. I say I love him, and if Peter wishes to kill him, he must kill me first." "Sir Peter Brome," said the king, "the judgment lies in your hand. We give you the man's life, to grant or take." Peter thought a while, then answered, "I grant him his life, if he will acknowledge this lady to be his true and lawful wife, and live with her as such, now and forever, staying all suits against her." "How can he do that, you fool?" asked Betty, "when you have knocked all his senses out of him with that great sword of yours?" "Perhaps," suggested Peter humbly, "some one will do it for him." "Yes," said Isabella, speaking for the first time, "I will. On behalf of the Marquis of Morella, I promise these things, Don Peter Brome, before all these people here gathered. I add this, that if he should live, and it please him to break this promise made on his behalf to save him from death, then let his name be shamed. Yes, let it become a byword and a scorn. Proclaim it, heralds." So the heralds blew their trumpets, and one of them called out the queen's decree, whereat the spectators cheered again, shouting that it was good, and they bore witness to that promise. Then Morella, still senseless, was borne away by his squires, Betty in her blood-stained robe marching at his side, and his horse having been brought to him again, Peter, wounded though he was, mounted and galloped round the arena amidst plaudits such as that place had never heard, till, lifting his sword in salutation, suddenly he and his gentlemen vanished by the gate through which he had appeared. Thus, strangely enough, ended that combat which thereafter was always known as the fray of the Eagle and the English Hawk. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of Fair Margaret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Fair Margaret by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 25. How the Margaret won out to sea. It was night. Peter, faint with loss of blood and stiff with bruises, had bade his farewell to their Majesties of Spain, who spoke many soft words to him, calling him the flower of knighthood, and offering him high place and rank if he would abide in their service. But he thanked them and said no, for in Spain he had suffered too much to dwell there. So they kissed his bride, the fair Margaret, who clung to her wounded husband like ivy to an oak, and would not be separated from him, even for a moment, that husband whom living she had scarcely hoped to clasp again. Yes, they kissed her, and the queen threw about her a chain from her own neck as a parting gift, and wished her joy of so gallant a lord. "Alas, your majesty," said Margaret, her dark eyes filling with tears, "how can I be joyous, who must think of tomorrow?" Thereon Isabella set her face, and answered, "Donna Margaret Brome, be thankful for what to-day has brought you, and forget to-morrow and that which it must justly take away. Go now, and God be with you both." So they went, the little knot of English sailormen, who, wrapped in Spanish cloaks, had sat together in the amphitheatre and groaned when the eagle struck, and cheered when the falcon swooped, leading, or rather carrying, Peter, under cover of the falling night, to a boat not far from this place of bulls. In this they embarked unobserved, for the multitude, and even Peter's own squires, believed that he had returned with his wife to the palace, as he had given out that he would do. So they were rowed to the Margaret, which straightway made as though she were about to sail, and indeed dropped a little way down-stream. Here she anchored again, just round the bend of the river, and lay there for the night. It was a heavy night, and in it there was no place for love or lovers' tenderness. How could there be between these two, who for so long had been tormented by doubts and fears, and on this day had endured such extremity of terror and such agony of joy? Peter's wound also was deep and wide, though his shield had broken the weight of Morella's sword, and its edge had caught upon his shoulder-piece, so that by good chance it had not reached down to the arteries, or shorn into the bone. Yet he had lost much blood, and Smith, the captain, who was a better surgeon than might have been guessed from his thick hands, found it needful to wash out the cut with spirit that gave much pain, and to stitch it up with silk. Also Peter had great bruises on his arms and thighs, and his back was hurt by that fall from the white charger with Morella in his arms. So it came about that most of that night he lay outworn, half sleeping and half waking, and when at sunrise he struggled from his berth, it was but to kneel by the side of Margaret, and join her in her prayers that her father might be rescued from the hands of these cruel priests of Spain. Now during the night Smith had brought his ship back with the tide, and laid her under the shelter of those hulks whereof Peter had spoken, having first painted out her name of Margaret, and in its place set that of the Santa Maria, a vessel of about the same build and tonnage, which, as they had heard, was expected in port. For this reason, or because there were at that time many ships in the river, it happened that none in authority noted her return, or, if they did, neglected to report the matter as one of no moment. Therefore, so far all went well. According to the tale of Henriques, confirmed by what they had learned otherwise, the great procession of the Act of Faith would turn on to the quay at about 8 o'clock, and pass along it for 100 yards or so only, before it wound away down a street leading to the plaza, where the theatre was prepared, the sermon would be preached, the mass celebrated, and the relaxed placed in cages to be carried to the quemadero. At 6 in the morning Smith mustered those 12 men whom he had chosen to help him in the enterprise, and Peter, with Margaret at his side, addressed them in the cabin, telling them all the plan, and praying them for the sake of their master and of the Lady Margaret his daughter, to do what men might to save one whom they loved and honoured from so horrible a death. They swore that they would, every one of them, for their English blood was up, nor did they so much as speak of the great rewards that had been promised to those who lived through this adventure, and to the families of those who fell. Then they breakfasted, girded their swords and knives about them, and put on their Spanish cloaks, though, to speak the truth, these lads of Essex and of London made but poor Spaniards. Now, at length, the boat was ready, and Peter, although he could scarcely stand, desired to be carried into it, that he might accompany them. But the captain, Smith, to whom perhaps Margaret had been speaking, set down his flat foot on the deck, and said that he, who commanded there, would suffer no such thing. A wounded man, he declared, would but cumber them who had little room to spare in that small boat, and could be of no service, either on land or water. Moreover, Master Peter's face was known to thousands who had watched it yesterday, and would certainly be recognized, whereas none would take note at such a time of a dozen common sailors landed from some ship to see the show. Lastly, he would do best to stop on board the vessel, where, if anything went wrong, they must be short-handed enough, who, if they could, ought to get her away to sea and across it with all speed. Still Peter would have gone, till Margaret, throwing her arms about him, asked him if he thought that she would be the better if she lost both her father and her husband, as, if things miscarried, well might happen. Then, being in pain and very weak, he yielded, and Smith, having given his last directions to the mate, and shaken Peter and Margaret by the hand, asking their prayers for all of them, descended with his 12 men into the boat, and dropping down under shelter of the hulks, rowed to the shore as though they came from some other vessel. Now the quay was not more than a bow-shoot from them, and from a certain spot upon the Margaret there was a good view of it between the stern of one hulk and the bow of another. Here then Peter and Margaret sat themselves down behind the bulwark, and watched with fears such as cannot be told, while a sharp-eyed seaman climbed to the crow's nest on the mast, whence he could see over much of the city, and even the old Moorish castle that was then the holy house of the Inquisition. Presently this man reported that the procession had started, for he saw its banners and the people crowding to the windows and to the roof-tops. Also the cathedral bell began to toll slowly. Then came a long, long wait, during which their little knot of sailors wearing the Spanish cloaks appeared upon the quay and mingled with the few folk that were gathered there, since the most of the people were collected by thousands on the great plaza or in the adjacent streets. At length, just as the cathedral clock struck 8, the triumphant march, as it was called, began to appear on the quay. First came a body of soldiers with lances, then a crucifix, borne by a priest and veiled in black crape, then a number of other priests, clad in snow-white robes to symbolize their perfect purity. Next followed men carrying wood or leather images of some man or woman who, by flight to a foreign land or into the realms of death, had escaped the clutches of the Inquisition. After these marched other men in 4s, each 4 of them bearing a coffin that contained the body or bones of some dead heretic, which, in the absence of his living person, like the effigies, were to be committed to the flames as a token of what the Inquisition would have done to him if it could, to enable it also to seize his property. Then came many penitents, their heads shaven, their feet bare, and clad, some in dark-coloured cloaks, some in yellow robes, called the San Benito, which were adorned with a red cross. These were followed by a melancholy band of relaxed heretics, doomed to the fire or strangulation at the stake, and clothed in zamarras of sheepskin, painted all over with devils and the portraits of their own faces surrounded by flames. These poor creatures also wore flame-adorned caps called corozas, shaped like bishops' mitres, and were gagged with blocks of wood, lest they should contaminate the populace by some declaration of their heresy, while in their hands they bore tapers, which the monks who accompanied them relighted from time to time if they became extinguished. Now the hearts of Peter and Margaret leaped within them, for at the end of this hideous troop rode a man mounted on an ass, clothed in a zamarra and coroza, but with a noose about his neck. So the Fray Henriques had told the truth, for without doubt this was John Castell. Like people in a dream they saw him advance in his garb of shame, and after him, gorgeously attired, civil officers, inquisitors, and familiars of noble rank, members of the Council of Inquisition, behind whom was borne a flaunting banner, called the Holy Standard of Faith. Now Castell was opposite to the little group of seamen, and, or so it seemed, something went wrong with the harness of the ass on which he sat, for it stopped, and a man in the garb of a secretary stepped to it. apparently to attend to a strap, thus bringing all the procession behind to a halt, while that in front proceeded off the quay and round the corner of the street. Whatever it might be that had happened, it necessitated the dismounting of the heretic, who was pulled roughly off the brute's back, which, as though in joy at this riddance of its burden, lifted its head and brayed loudly. Men from the thin line of crowd that edged the quay came forward as though to help, and among them were several in capes, such as were worn by the sailors of the Margaret. The officers and grandees behind shouted "Forward! Forward!" whereon those attending to the ass hustled it, and its rider, a little nearer to the water's edge, while the guards ran back to explain what had happened. Then suddenly a confusion arose, of which it was impossible to distinguish the cause, and next instant Margaret and Peter, still gripping each other, saw the man who had been seated on the ass being dragged rapidly down the steps of the quay, at the foot of which lay the boat of the Margaret. The mate at the helm saw also, for he blew his whistle, a sign at which the anchor was slipped. There was no time to lift it, and men who were waiting on the yards loosed the lashings of certain sails, so that almost immediately the ship began to move. Now they were fighting on the quay. The heretic was in the boat, and most of the sailors, but others held back the crowd of priests and armed familiars who strove to get at him. One, a priest with a sword in his hand, slipped past them and tumbled into the boat also. At last all were in, save a single man, who was attacked by 3 adversaries. John Smith, the captain. The oars were out, but his mates waited for him. He struck with his sword, and someone fell. Then he turned to run. 2 masked familiars sprang at him, one landing on his back, one clinging to his neck. With a desperate effort he cast himself into the water, dragging them with him. One they saw no more, for Smith had stabbed him. The other floated up near the boat, which already was some yards from the quay, and a sailor battered him on the head with an oar, so that he sank. Smith had vanished also, and they thought he must be drowned. The sailors thought it too, for they began to give way, when suddenly a great brown hand appeared and clasped the stern sheets, while a bull voice roared, "Row on, lads, I'm right enough." Row they did indeed, till the ashen oars bent like bows. Only 2 of them seized the officer who had sprung into the boat and flung himself screaming into the river, where he struggled for a while, for he could not swim, gripping at the air with his hands, then disappeared. The boat was in midstream now, and shaping her course round the bow of the first hulk beyond which the prow of the Margaret began to appear, for the wind was fresh, and she gathered way every moment. "Let down the ladder, and make ready ropes," shouted Peter. It was done, but not too soon, for next instant the boat was bumping on their side. The sailors in her caught the ropes and hung on, while the captain, Smith, half drowned, clung to the stern sheets, for the water washed over his head. "Save him first," cried Peter. A man running down the ladder threw a noose to him, which Smith seized with one hand, and by degrees worked beneath his arms. Then they tackled on to it, and dragged him bodily from the river to the deck, where he lay gasping and spitting out foam and water. By now the ship was travelling swiftly, so swiftly that Margaret was in agony of fear lest the boat should be towed under and sink. But these sailor-men knew their trade. By degrees they let the boat drop back till her bow was abreast of the ladder. Then they helped Castell forward. He gripped its rungs, and eager hands gripped him. Up he staggered, step by step, till at length his hideous, fiend-painted cap, his white face, whence the beard had been shaved, and his open mouth, in which still was fixed the wooden gag, appeared above the bulwarks, as the mate said afterwards, like that of a devil escaped from hell. They lifted him over, and he sank fainting in his daughter's arms. Then one by one the sailors came up after him. None were missing, though 2 had been wounded, and were covered with blood. No, none were missing. God had brought them, every one, safe back to the deck of the Margaret. Smith, the captain, spat up the last of his river water and called for a cup of wine, which he drank, while Peter and Margaret drew the accursed gag from her father's mouth and poured spirit down his throat. Shaking the water from him like a giant dog, but never saying a word, Smith rolled to the helm and took it from the mate, for the navigation of the river was difficult, and none knew it so well as he. Now they were abreast the famous Golden Tower, and a big gun was fired at them, but the shot went wide. "Look!" said Margaret, pointing to horsemen galloping southwards along the river bank. "Yes," said Peter, "they go to warn the ports. God send that the wind holds, for we must fight our way to sea." The wind did hold. Indeed, it blew ever more strongly from the north. But oh, that was a long, evil day. Hour after hour they sped forward down the widening river, now past villages where knots of people waved weapons at them as they went, now by desolate marshes, plains, and banks clothed with pine. When they reached Bonanza the sun was low, and when they were off San Lucar it began to sink. Out into the wide river mouth, where the white waters tumbled on the narrow bar, rowed 2 great galleys to cut them off, very swift galleys, which it seemed impossible to escape. Margaret and Castell were sent below, the crew went to quarters, and Peter crept stiffly aft to where the sturdy Smith stood at the helm, which he would suffer no other man to touch. Smith looked at the sky, he looked at the shore, and the safe, open sea beyond. Then he bade them hoist more sail, all that she could carry, and looked grimly at the 2 galleys lurking like deerhounds in a pass, that hung on their oars in the strait channel, and the tumbling breakers on either side, through which no ship could sail. "What will you do?" asked Peter. "Master Peter," he answered between his teeth, "when you fought the Spaniard yesterday, I did not ask you what you were going to do. Hold your tongue, and leave me to my own trade." The Margaret was a swift ship, but never yet had she moved so swiftly. Behind her shrilled the gale, for now it was no less. Her stout masts bent like fishing poles, her rigging creaked and groaned beneath the weight of the bellying canvas. Her port bulwarks slipped along almost level with the water, so that Peter must lie down on the deck, for stand he could not, and watch it running by within 3 feet of him. The galleys drew up right across her path. Half a mile away they lay bow by bow, knowing well that no ship could pass the foaming shallows. Lay bow by bow, waiting to board and cut down this little English crew, when the Margaret shortened sail, as shorten sail she must. Smith yelled an order to the mate, and presently, red in the setting sun, out burst the flag of England upon the mainmast top, a sight at which the sailors cheered. He shouted another order, and up rang the last jib, so that now from time to time the port bulwarks dipped beneath the sea, and Peter felt salt water stinging his sore back. Thus did the Margaret shorten sail, and thus did she yield her to the great galleys of Spain. The captains of the galleys hung on. Was this foreigner mad, or ignorant of the river channel, they wondered, that he would sink with every soul there upon the bar? They hung on, waiting for that leopard flag and those bursting sails to come down. But they never stirred, only straight at them rushed the Margaret like a bull. She was not 2 furlongs away, and she held dead upon her course, till at last those galleys saw that she would not sink alone. Like a bull with shut eyes she held dead upon her furious course. Confusion arose upon the Spanish ships. Whistles were blown, men shouted, overseers ran down the planks flogging the slaves, lifted oars shone red in the light of the dying sun as they beat the water wildly. The prows began to back and separate, 5 feet, 10 feet, a dozen feet perhaps, then straight into that tiny streak of open water, like a stone from the hand of the slinger, like an arrow from a bow, rushed the wind-flung Margaret. What happened? Go ask it of the fishers of San Lucar and the pirates of Bonanza, where the tale has been told for generations. The great oars snapped like reeds, the slaves were thrown in crushed and mangled heaps, the tall deck of the port galley was ripped out of her like rent paper by the stout yards of the stooping Margaret. The side of the starboard galley rolled up like a shaving before a plane, and the Margaret rushed through. Smith, the captain, looked aft to where, ere they sank, the 2 great ships, like wounded swans, rolled and fluttered on the foaming bar. Then he put his helm about, called the carpenter, and asked what water she made. "None, sir," he answered, "but she will want new tarring. It was oak against eggshells, and we had the speed." "Good," said Smith. "Shallows on either side, life or death, and I thought I could make room. Send the mate to the helm. I'll have a sleep." Then the sun vanished beneath the roaring open sea, and escaped from all the power of Spain. The Margaret turned her scarred and splintered bow for Ushant and for England. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of Fair Margaret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Roohi. Fair Margaret by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 26. Envoi. 10 years had gone by since Captain Smith took the good ship Margaret across the bar of the Guadalquivir in a very notable fashion. It was late May in Essex, and all the woods were green, and all the birds sang, and all the meadows were bright with flowers. Down in the lovely vale of Dedham there was a long, low house with many gables, a charming old house of red brick and timbers already black with age. It stood upon a little hill, backed with woods, and from it a long avenue of ancient oaks ran across the park to the road which led to Colchester and London. Down that avenue on this May afternoon an aged, white-haired man with quick black eyes was walking, and with him 3 children, very beautiful children, a boy of about 9 and 2 little girls, who clung to his hand and garments and pestered him with questions. "Where are we going, grandfather?" asked one little girl. "To see Captain Smith, my dear," he answered. "I don't like Captain Smith," said the other little girl. "He is so fat and says nothing." "I do," broke in the boy. "He gave me a fine knife to use when I am a sailor, and mother does, and father, yes, and granddad too, because he saved him when the cruel Spaniards wanted to put him in the fire. Don't you, granddad?" "Yes, my dear," answered the old man. "Look, there is a squirrel running over the grass. See if you can catch it before it reaches that tree." Off went the children at full pelt, and the tree, being a low one, began to climb it after the squirrel. Meanwhile John Castell, for it was he, turned through the park gate and walked to a little house by the roadside, where a stout man sat upon a bench contemplating nothing in particular. Evidently he expected his visitor, for he pointed to the place beside him, and, as Castell sat down, said, "Why didn't you come yesterday, master?" "Because of my rheumatism, friend," he answered. "I got it first in the vaults of that accursed holy house at Seville, and it grows on me year by year. They were very damp and cold, those vaults," he added reflectively. "Many people found them hot enough," grunted Smith. "Also, there was generally a good fire at the end of them. Strange thing that we should never have heard any more of that business. I suppose it was because our Margaret was such a favourite with Queen Isabella, who didn't want to raise questions with England or stir up dirty water." "Perhaps," answered Castell. "The water was dirty, wasn't it?" "Dirty as a Thames mudbank at low tide. Clever woman, Isabella. No one else would have thought of making a man ridiculous as she did by Morella when she gave his life to Betty, and promised and vowed on his behalf that he would acknowledge her as his lady. No fear of any trouble from him after that, in the way of plots for the crown or things of that sort. Why, he must have been the laughing stock of the whole land, and a laughing stock never does anything. You remember the Spanish saying, 'King's swords cut and priests' fires burn, but street songs kill quickest'? I should like to learn more of what has become of them all, though, wouldn't you, master? Except Bernaldez, of course, for he's been safe in Paris these many years, and doing well there, they say." "Yes," answered Castell with a little smile. "That is, unless I had to go to Spain to find out." Just then the 3 children came running up, bursting through the gate all together. "Mind my flower bed, you little rogues," shouted Captain Smith, shaking his stick at them, whereat they got behind him and made faces. "Where's the squirrel, Peter?" asked Castell. "We've hunted it out of the tree, Grandad, and right across the grass, and got round it by the edge of the brook, and then—" "Then what? Did you catch it?" "No, Grandad, for when we thought we had it sure, it jumped into the water and swam away." "Other people in a fix have done that before," said Castell, laughing, and bethinking him of a certain river key. "It wasn't fair," cried the boy indignantly. "Squirrels shouldn't swim, and if I can catch it, I will put it in a cage." "I think that squirrel will stop in the woods for the rest of its life, Peter." "Grandad, Grandad," called out the youngest child from the gate, whither she had wandered, being weary of the tale of the squirrel. "There are a lot of people coming down the road on horses. Such fine people. Come and see." This news excited the curiosity of the old gentleman, for not many fine people came to Denham. At any rate, both of them rose somewhat stiffly and walked to the gate to look. Yes, the child was right, for there, sure enough, about 200 yards away, advanced an imposing cavalcade. In front of it, mounted on a fine horse, sat a still finer lady, a very large and handsome lady, dressed in black silks and wearing a black lace veil that hung from her head. At her side was another lady, much muffled up as though she found the climate cold, and riding between them on a pony a gallant-looking little boy. After these came servants, male and female, 6 or 8 of them, and last of all a great wain laden with baggage, drawn by 4 big Flemish horses. "Now whom have we here?" ejaculated Castell, staring at them. Captain Smith stared too, and sniffed at the wind, as he had often done upon his deck on a foggy morning. "I seem to smell Spaniards," he said, "which is a smell I don't like. Look at their rigging. Now, Master Castell, of whom does that bark with all her sails set remind you?" Castell shook his head doubtfully. "I seem to remember," went on Smith, "a great girl decked out like a maypole running across white sand in that place of bulls at Seville, but I forgot. You weren't there, were you?" Now a loud, ringing voice was heard speaking in Spanish, and commanding someone to go to yonder house and inquire where was the gate to the old hall. Then Castell knew at once. "It is Betty," he said. "By the beard of Abraham, it is Betty." "I think so too, but don't talk of Abraham, master. He is a dangerous man. Abraham, in these very Christian lands, say, by the keys of St. Peter, or by St. Paul's infirmities." "Child," broke in Castell, turning to one of the little girls, "run up to the hall and tell your father and mother that Betty has come and brought half Spain with her. Quickly now, and remember the name Betty." The child departed, wondering, by the back way, while Castell and Smith walked towards the strangers. "Can we assist you, Senora?" asked the former in Spanish. "Marchioness of Morella, if you please," she began in the same language, then suddenly added in English, "Why, bless my eyes, if it isn't my old master, John Castell, with white wool instead of black." "It became white after my shaving by a sainted barber in the Holy House," said Castell. "But come off that tall horse of yours, Betty, my dear. I beg your pardon, most noble and highly born Marchioness of Morella, and give me a kiss." "That I will, 20 if you like," she answered, arriving in his arms so suddenly from on high that had it not been for the sturdy support of Smith behind, they would both of them have rolled upon the ground. "Whose are those children?" she asked, when she had kissed Castell and shaken Smith by the hand. "But no need to ask. They have got my cousin Margaret's eyes and Peter's long nose. How are they?" she added anxiously. "You will see for yourself in a minute or two. Come, send on your people and baggage to the hall, though where they will stow them all I don't know, and walk with us." Betty hesitated, for she had been calculating upon the effect of a triumphal entry in full state. But at that moment there appeared Margaret and Peter themselves. Margaret, a beautiful matron with a child in her arms, running, and Peter looking much as he had always been, spare, long of limb, stern, but for the kindly eyes, striding away behind, and after him sundry servants and the little girl Margaret. Then there arose a veritable babel of tongues, punctuated by embracings, but in the end the retinue and the baggage were got off up the drive, followed by the children and the little Spanish-looking boy, with whom they had already made friends, leaving only Betty and her closely muffled-up attendant. This attendant Peter contemplated for a while, as though there was something familiar to him in her general air. Apparently, she observed his interest, for as though by accident she moved some of the wrappings that hid her face, revealing a single soft and lustrous eye and a few square inches of olive-coloured cheek. Then Peter knew her at once. "How are you, Inez?" he said, stretching out his hand with a smile, for really he was delighted to see her. "As well as a poor wanderer in a strange and very damp country can be, Don Peter," she answered in her languorous voice, "and certainly somewhat the better for seeing an old friend, whom last she met in a certain baker's shop. Do you remember?" "Remember?" answered Peter. "It's not a thing I'm likely to forget, Inez. What became of Fray Henriques?" "I have heard several different stories." "One never can be sure," she answered, as she uncovered her smiling red lips. "There are so many dungeons in that old Moorish holy house and elsewhere that it is impossible to keep count of their occupants, however good your information. All I know is that he got into trouble over that business, poor man. Suspicions arose about his conduct in the procession which the captain here will recall," and she pointed to Smith. "Also, it is very dangerous for men in such positions to visit Jewish quarters and to write incautious letters. No, not the one you think of. I kept faith, but others afterwards, begging for it back again, some of which miscarried." "Is he dead, then?" asked Peter. "Worse, I think," she answered. "A living death, the punishment of the wall." "Poor wretch," said Peter with a shudder. "Yes," remarked Inez reflectively. "Few doctors like their own medicine." "I say, Inez," said Peter, nodding his head towards Betty, "that Marquis isn't coming here, is he?" "In the spirit, perhaps, Don Peter, not otherwise." "So he is really dead. What killed him?" "Laughter, I think, or rather being laughed at. He got quite well of the hurts you gave him, and then, of course, he had to keep the Queen's gage and take the most noble lady yonder, late Betty, as his Marchioness. He couldn't do less, after she beat you off him with your own sword and nursed him back to life. But he never heard the last of it. They made songs about him in the streets and would ask him how his godmother, Isabella, was, because she had promised and vowed on his behalf also. Whether the Marchioness had broken any lances for his sake lately, and so forth. "Poor man," said Peter again, in tones of the deepest sympathy. "A cruel fate. I should have done better to kill him." "Much, but don't say so to the noble Betty, who thinks that he had a very happy married life under her protecting care. Really, he ate his heart out till even I, who hated him, was sorry. Think of it. One of the proudest men in Spain, and the most gallant, a nephew of the king, a pillar of the church, his sovereign's plenipotentiary to the Moors, and on secret matters, the common mock of the vulgar, yes, and of the great too." "The great? Which of them?" "Nearly all, for the Queen set the fashion. I wonder why she hated him so," Inez added, looking shrewdly at Peter. Then, without waiting for an answer, went on. "She did it very cleverly, by always making the most of the most honourable Betty in public, calling her near to her, talking with her, admiring her English beauty, and so forth. And what Her Majesty did, everybody else did, until my exalted mistress nearly went off her head, so full was she of pride and glory. As for the Marquis, he fell ill, and after the taking of Granada went to live there quietly. Betty went with him, for she was a good wife, and saved lots of money. She buried him a year ago, for he died slow, and gave him one of the finest tombs in Spain. It isn't finished yet. That is all the story. Now she has brought her boy, the young Marquis, to England for a year or two, for she has a very warm heart, and longed to see you all, although she thought she had better go away a while for her son's sake. As for me, now that Morella is dead, I am head of the household, secretary, general purveyor of intelligence, and anything else you like at a good salary." "You are not married, I suppose?" asked Peter. "No, Inez answered. I saw so much of men when I was younger that I seem to have had enough of them. Or perhaps, she went on, fixing that mild and lustrous eye upon him, there was one of them whom I liked too well to wish. She paused, for they had crossed the drawbridge and arrived opposite to the old hall. The gorgeous Betty and the fair Margaret, accompanied by the others and talking rapidly, had passed through the wide doorway into its spacious vestibule. Inez looked after them and perceived, standing like a guard at the foot of the open stair, that scarred suit of white armour and riven shield blazoned with the golden falcon, Isabella's gift, in which Peter had fought and conquered the Marquis of Morella. Then she stepped back and contemplated the house critically. At each end of it arose a stone tower, built for the purposes of defence, and all around ran a deep moat. Within the circle of his moat, and surrounded by poplars and ancient yews on the south side of the hall, lay a walled pleasaunce, or garden, or turf pierced by paths and planted with flowering hawthorns and other shrubs, and at the end of it, almost hidden in drooping willows, a stone basin of water. Looking at it, Inez saw at once that so far as the circumstances of climate and situation would allow, Peter, in the laying out of this place, had copied another in the far-off southern city of Granada, even down to the details of the steps and seats. She turned to him and said innocently, Sir Peter, are you minded to walk with me in that garden this pleasant evening? I did not see any window in yonder tower. Peter turned red as the scar across his face, and laughed as he answered, There may be one for all that. Get you into the house, dear Inez, for none can be more welcome there, but I walk no more alone with you in gardens. The end. End of Fair Margaret by H. Rider Haggard.